After my mother passed away, my father married the woman he was secretly seeing behind her back. For a decade, I was treated like an unwanted guest in my own family, mocked for my career while they lived in absolute luxury. But when I uncovered a hidden legal document my mother left behind, I realized their perfect life was built on a ticking time bomb. On Mother's Day, I handed my stepmother a velvet gift box containing the brutal truth and watched her entire world shatter. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Isabella. I am 33 years old and I work as a high-end estate appraiser in San Francisco. My career taught me that true value is never obvious at first glance. It requires patience digging through archives and understanding the hidden layers of ownership. My family thought I was just a glorified pawnshop worker, completely blind to the fact that my daily life involved unspooling complex legal trusts and handling multi-million-dollar estate transfers. They vastly underestimated my intelligence and my resources. The tension at the table was suffocating. We were seated in the center of Le Jardin, the most exclusive Michelin star restaurant in the city. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over white tablecloths, and soft piano music played in the background. I had barely touched my sparkling water when Cassandra, my stepmother, leaned across the table. Her perfectly manicured hand shot out, shoving my salad plate away with a loud scrape against the fine bone china. "This table is for family Isabella," she sneered, her voice carrying just enough to turn the heads of the wealthy diners nearby. "Someone who digs through dead people's junk for a living will stain Penelope's Chanel dress." I looked at Penelope, my spoiled stepsister, who was busy admiring her reflection in a polished silver spoon. She contributed absolutely nothing to society, but happily consumed everything my father provided. Penelope let out a short, haughty laugh, adjusting her designer jacket and refusing to even make eye contact with me. I felt the familiar burn of humiliation in my chest, a feeling I had endured since I was in my early 20s. I turned my gaze to my biological father, Richard. I waited for him to defend me, to act like a father for once in his life. Instead, Richard cleared his throat nervously, adjusting his expensive silk tie. "Listen to your mother, Bella," he said, his voice laced with intense annoyance. "It is Mother's Day. Do not throw a tantrum like you did at your own mother's funeral 10 years ago, just because I made our relationship public." The sheer audacity of his statement was staggering. 10 years ago, as I stood weeping over my mother Helen's casket, Richard had arrived with Cassandra holding his arm, publicly confirming their long-standing affair before my mother was even buried in the ground. When I broke down in tears of profound betrayal, they called it a tantrum. They labeled me the problematic child, the scapegoat, while Cassandra stepped smoothly into the role of the devoted matriarch. I took a deep breath, grounding myself in reality. I did not run out of the restaurant crying. I did not raise my voice. I stayed planted in my heavy oak chair, staring directly into Cassandra's cold, calculating eyes. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out a small, heavy velvet box. The deep red fabric looked entirely out of place among the minimalist, modern tableware. I placed it gently in the exact center of the table. "Happy Mother's Day, Cassandra." I said, my voice incredibly steady and completely devoid of emotion. "I have held on to this for a decade." Cassandra looked at the box, her smug smile faltering for a fraction of a second. Her greed, however, always overpowered her caution. Assuming it was an expensive piece of jewelry, a desperate peace offering from her defeated stepdaughter, she eagerly snapped the metal hinges open. I watched the exact moment her fabricated reality cracked into a million pieces. There was no diamond necklace inside. Instead, neatly folded to fit the velvet cushion, was a miniature framed document. Cassandra pulled it out, her eyes scanning the bold black text at the top of the heavy parchment paper. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her foundation looking like a pale artificial mask. It was an official eviction notice accompanied by a stamped asset freeze order from the state of California. "What is this garbage?" Cassandra hissed, her hands beginning to tremble violently as she shoved the paper toward my father. Richard looked at the legal document, his eyes widening in pure confusion and mounting terror. He frantically read the official state seals and the harsh legal terminology. DeAndre, Penelope's husband, leaned back in his chair and laughed loudly. DeAndre was a highly charismatic African-American man who always wore custom-tailored suits and carried himself like a Silicon Valley king. He masqueraded as a brilliant cryptocurrency millionaire, using the Thorne family name to scam the elite financial circles of the city. "What kind of cheap joke is this?" DeAndre mocked, tossing his linen napkin onto the table with a theatrical sigh. "I just used that mansion as collateral for my crypto hedge fund yesterday. There is no way an eviction notice means anything to us." I turned my attention fully to him, letting a slow, calculated smirk spread across my face. "Are you sure about that?" DeAndre, I asked, leaning forward so he could hear every single syllable clearly. "You just used a house my father does not legally own to secure a $5 million federal bank loan. In America, we call that wire fraud." The silence that followed my statement was deafening. The ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to fade away entirely as the gravity of my words settled over the table. Cassandra was gasping for air, as if she had forgotten how to breathe. Richard was physically shaking his eyes, darting between the eviction notice and my calm, unwavering expression. For 10 long years they had built a fortress of lies, convinced that they were untouchable, and that I was nothing more than an irrelevant nuisance. They had used my mother's wealth to fund their arrogant lifestyle, parading around San Francisco society, while actively excluding me from my own rightful heritage. They thought they had buried my mother's legacy completely, but they forgot that I make my living evaluating what the dead leave behind. My meticulous nature had uncovered the hidden truths they tried so desperately to conceal. The trap had been set perfectly, and now right in the middle of their celebratory brunch, the steel jaws were finally snapping shut. The heavy mahogany table shuddered as DeAndre slammed his large hands down flat against the pristine white tablecloth. The crystal wine glasses rattled dangerously, spilling droplets of expensive red wine onto the linen. His confident, wealthy facade evaporated instantly, replaced by a raw, unhinged aggression. "Do not play games with me, Isabella," he growled, pointing a thick finger directly at my face. "You are nothing but a glorified junk dealer. You do not know the first thing about high-level corporate finance or federal banking regulations. I have top-tier lawyers who will bury you in litigation before you can even blink." Penelope, fueled by her husband's sudden outburst and her own profound sense of entitlement, grabbed her crystal goblet filled with ice water. With a vicious shriek, she hurled the freezing contents straight into my face. "You are just a jealous, bitter 33-year-old spinster," Penelope screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings and causing several waiters to freeze in their tracks. "You are doing this because you cannot stand the fact that DeAndre bought me a brand new Porsche yesterday while you drive a pathetic used sedan. You have always been insanely jealous of my perfect life." I did not flinch. The freezing water dripped down my chin, soaking the collar of my silk blouse, but my posture remained perfectly rigid. I slowly reached for a thick cloth napkin and calmly dabbed the moisture from my cheeks, refusing to give them the satisfaction of an emotional reaction. My years of maintaining professional composure during highly contentious estate liquidations had trained me perfectly for this exact moment. I looked at Penelope with a mixture of pity and absolute triumph. "Bought a Porsche with the Thorne corporate credit card," I asked, my voice carrying a lethal softness that cut through the ambient noise of the restaurant. Penelope's arrogant sneer faltered slightly. "Yes," she snapped. "My husband is an executive partner. He has full corporate purchasing privileges." I slowly shook my head, pulling a thick manila envelope from my leather tote bag. The same Thorn Corporation where 80% of the outstanding shares were legally frozen at 8 a.m. today? I asked, placing the heavy envelope on the table. I unclasped the string and pulled out a stack of highlighted bank statements, pushing them directly toward my father, Richard. The truth is, DeAndre is not a self-made cryptocurrency millionaire. He never was. His entire hedge fund is a catastrophic failure built on a Ponzi scheme structure. To keep up the lavish lifestyle and buy your ridiculous designer cars, he needed capital. So he secretly drained your father's executive retirement accounts to cover his massive crypto losses. Richard stared at me, his face turning an unhealthy shade of ashen gray. "What are you talking about?" Richard stammered, his hands shaking as he reached for the highlighted bank statements. He scanned the columns of numbers, his eyes widening in absolute horror as he saw the repeated unauthorized wire transfers draining his life savings into offshore accounts controlled by DeAndre. "My pension," Richard whispered, his voice cracking with pure devastation. "My entire pension is gone." DeAndre stood up abruptly, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. He looked around the restaurant, realizing that security guards were beginning to subtly edge closer to our table. "It was a temporary bridge loan," DeAndre lied, frantically, sweat beading on his forehead. "I was going to replace the funds next week after the new crypto token launched. I just needed liquidity." Richard turned his horrified gaze from the documents to his wife. "Cassandra, you handle the secondary corporate authorizations. How could you let him do this? How could you approve these transfers without telling me?" Cassandra shrank back into her chair, her glamorous demeanor entirely destroyed. She looked like a cornered animal. "I did not know the fund was failing," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "DeAndre promised me a 30% return on the investment. He said if we quietly used the retirement funds as leverage, we could double our net worth by the end of the fiscal year. He swore it was a guaranteed win. You gambled my entire life savings because he promised you a quick payout," Richard yelled, no longer caring about the wealthy audience watching their dramatic downfall. "You authorized the theft of my pension behind my back." Penelope looked back and forth between her mother and her husband, the reality of her shattered luxury finally beginning to register in her mind. "DeAndre, tell them they are wrong. Tell them we still have our money." Before DeAndre could formulate another desperate lie, his expensive smartphone began to vibrate aggressively on the table. The caller ID flashed brightly, showing a restricted government number. DeAndre stared at the glowing screen, as if it were a venomous snake absolutely paralyzed by fear. I smiled, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water. "You should probably answer that, DeAndre," I suggested smoothly. "I have it on very good authority that it is the Federal Bureau of Investigation executing a joint search warrant with the Securities and Exchange Commission at your downtown office right now. They tend to get very impatient when people ignore their calls." The color completely drained from Penelope's face as the gravity of the situation finally pierced her arrogant delusion. Her designer clothes and expensive jewelry suddenly seemed like heavy chains anchoring her to a sinking ship. She grabbed DeAndre's arm, shaking him violently, demanding that he fix the problem, but he was completely catatonic. The realization that his fraudulent empire had collapsed in a matter of seconds left him speechless. For years, this family had operated under the assumption that they were untouchable, hiding their financial decay behind a facade of country club memberships and luxury cars. They thought they could continuously exploit the Thorne family legacy without ever facing a single consequence. But I had spent the last month methodically verifying every stolen asset, cross-referencing bank routing numbers, and submitting anonymous tips to federal regulators. I had built an ironclad case against them while they were busy planning their next lavish vacation. The panic radiating from the table was intoxicating. The great Cassandra Belmont, who had spent a decade making me feel like a worthless outsider, was now hyperventilating into a cloth napkin. The entire foundation of their stolen wealth was crumbling right before their eyes, and this was only the beginning of the legal nightmare I had prepared for them. DeAndre dropped his phone onto the smooth table like it was burning his skin. the color completely drained from his face, replaced by a sheen of cold sweat. Without uttering a single word, he shoved his chair backward, nearly knocking it over, and bolted toward the main entrance of the restaurant. He pushed past a waiter carrying a tray of champagne glasses, sending crystals shattering onto the marble floor. But his desperate escape was cut brutally short. Two towering private security contractors' men I had personally hired and stationed by the exits for this exact moment stepped directly into his path. They grabbed DeAndre by his custom-tailored shoulders, physically lifting him off his feet and forcing him back toward our table. He struggled wildly, his expensive suit jacket tearing at the seam, but the guards held him in an iron grip, forcing him to sit back down in his chair. Penelope shrieked, burying her face in her hands, as the reality of her husband being physically restrained settled over her. The illusion of their untouchable high society life was officially dead. My father Richard finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. He slammed his fist onto the table, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "Isabella, what have you done?" he roared, ignoring the hushed whispers of the wealthy patrons surrounding us. "You have gone too far this time. DeAndre might be a fraud, but I still own the Thorne estate. I still own the primary assets. I will just liquidate the property to recover my pension and fix this mess. You have no right to interfere with my finances." I looked at my father with absolute pity. I reached out and picked up the red velvet box still sitting in the center of the table. "You really think you own the estate, Richard?" I asked smoothly. From the hidden compartment, I extracted two very specific items. The first was a yellowed handwritten letter, its edges curled with age. The second was a thick stack of legal parchment bound by a heavy wax seal, bearing the official crest of the state of Delaware. I placed them down. A month ago, a major bank hired me to evaluate the contents of several abandoned safe deposit boxes from a branch that was closing. One of those boxes was registered under a maiden name I recognized immediately. It belonged to my mother, Helen. Helen was brilliant. I continued leaning forward so they could hang on to my every word. "She knew about your affair with Cassandra long before she died. She knew you were sneaking around spending her money on this ridiculous woman. But my mother did not want the messy publicity of a divorce, nor did she want to leave me vulnerable to your financial incompetence. So instead of confronting you, she hired the best corporate lawyers in the country and established a Delaware quiet trust." "What are you talking about?" Richard stammered, his eyes darting frantically over the legal text visible on the table. "I was the sole beneficiary of her will. I inherited the estate." "You inherited a life estate," I corrected him, tapping the heavy parchment with my index finger. "You never owned the house or the primary assets, Richard. The quiet trust legally granted you the right to reside in the estate and use the assets only under very strict ironclad conditions. You were essentially a glorified tenant. My mother designed the trust with a specific trigger clause. If you ever attempted to mortgage the ancestral property, or if you ever allowed a non-blood relative to use the estate as collateral for any financial venture, your life estate rights would be instantly and permanently revoked." Penelope gasped loudly, looking at DeAndre, who was staring at the floor in absolute defeat. He had just admitted to using the estate as collateral for his fraudulent crypto hedge fund. The moment DeAndre signed those federal loan documents using the Thorne estate as leverage, the trust automatically executed its failsafe. Your rights evaporated into thin air. The trust dictated that upon such a violation, provided I had reached my 33rd birthday ownership of the entire Thorne estate and all associated corporate holdings would default entirely and irrevocably to me. Cassandra suddenly slammed her hands on the table, her diamond rings clinking against the wood. "You are lying!" she shrieked, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. "This is a fabrication." When Helen died, my personal lawyer reviewed every single document. He verified the will, he oversaw the probate, he confirmed Richard owned everything free and clear. There was no Delaware trust. "You are trying to steal our property with fake paperwork." I turned my gaze to my stepmother, letting a cold, victorious smile spread across my face. "I expected you to say that Cassandra, your lawyer, verified the will 10 years ago," I asked, raising an eyebrow. You mean the lawyer you slept with in a cheap motel to convince him to forge the probate documents and bury my mother's original instructions? Cassandra gasped sharply, covering her mouth with her hand, as if I had just struck her across the face. Yes, I found the motel receipts and the email trails in the safe deposit box too, I stated flatly. The FBI agents found them very illuminating when I handed them over last week. In fact, your favorite lawyer was officially disbarred this morning. He is currently cooperating fully with federal authorities to save himself from a lengthy prison sentence for conspiracy and fraud. Right on cue, the heavy mahogany doors of the restaurant's VIP section swung open. A man walked through, flanked by two more security guards. He was wearing a rumpled suit, his tie was loosened, and his face was utterly devoid of color. It was Cassandra's former lawyer, looking entirely ruined and disheveled. He stopped at the edge of our table, refusing to look Cassandra in the eye, clutching a federal subpoena in his severely trembling hands. I am sorry, Cassandra. The lawyer choked out, his voice barely a whisper above the ambient noise of the stunned dining room. I had absolutely no choice. The feds raided my office at the crack of dawn. They brought battering rams and tore through my filing cabinets. They found the original draft of Helen's will, the one we deliberately hid in the basement safe. They found the metadata on the forged signatures. Cassandra gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning a stark, bloodless white. You spineless coward, she hissed, her pristine socialite mask completely disintegrating into a portrait of pure malice. You promised me absolute attorney-client privilege. You swore on your license that we were protected. There is zero privilege when the attorney is an active co-conspirator in federal fraud. I corrected her, resting my elbows confidently on the table. He made a proffer agreement. He handed the state prosecutors every single email, every offshore bank transfer, and every recorded phone call from the last 10 years, just to shave a few years off his impending federal sentence. The lawyer finally looked up, his eyes glassy with unshed tears of utter panic. They offered me a deal, Cassandra. I flipped. I gave them everything. I am not spending the rest of my life rotting in a federal penitentiary for you. With that final devastating admission, the remaining strength left Cassandra's legs. She collapsed backward into her chair, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps, as the private security guards escorted the disgraced lawyer away from our table. The foundation of her stolen empire was officially dead, but Penelope simply could not process the collapse. The golden child who had spent her entire existence insulated by stolen money and fake prestige vehemently shook her head. Her perfectly curled hair whipped around her shoulders as she grabbed DeAndre by the lapels of his torn custom suit. Do something! Penelope shrieked, spittle flying from her lips. Call your elite Atlanta financial connections. Call your venture capitalist friends. Fix this right now. Transfer funds from your offshore accounts and buy this stupid restaurant so we can fire these security guards and kick her out onto the street. DeAndre just stared at her, his jaw completely slack. The man who usually commanded every room with his booming baritone and arrogant swagger looked like a deflated balloon. He tried to pull Penelope's frantic hands off his suit, but she dug her manicured nails in much deeper. DeAndre, I am talking to you, Penelope demanded, her voice reaching a pitch that made the nearby patrons physically flinch. Use your crypto assets. Pay off whatever this eviction notice is, and make my sister go away forever. You are a tech millionaire. Act like one. I could not help but laugh. It was a cold, sharp sound that sliced right through Penelope's hysterical demands. I calmly reached back into my leather tote bag. He is not calling anyone in Atlanta. Penelope, I said, sliding a thick manila folder across the mahogany table. Because those elite financial connections do not exist, just like his crypto hedge fund does not exist, just like his entire self-made millionaire origin story does not exist. Penelope froze her hands, still clutching DeAndre's jacket. She looked at me, pure venom flashing in her eyes. You are just a jealous, lying estate appraiser. My husband is a financial genius. Your husband is a career con artist, I stated flatly, tapping the folder. When I realized DeAndre was using the Thorne family name to secure illegal loans, I used my forensic accounting software to run a deep background check on his supposedly immaculate history. Do you want to know what I found? DeAndre closed his eyes, a look of pure, unadulterated defeat washing over his features. He knew exactly what was inside that folder. DeAndre Jenkins is not a single unattached tech mogul. I announced, projecting my voice so every single person at our table heard the devastating truth. He currently has a legally married wife named Clarissa, residing in a quiet, middle-class suburb of Chicago. And he has 3 children ranging from ages 4 to 9. You are not his wife, Penelope. You are his mark. Richard gasped, clutching his chest as if experiencing intense physical pain. You are already married, he wheezed, staring at the man he had proudly welcomed into his home. I have the official marriage certificate right here. I continued, pulling the certified document from the folder. Clarissa believes her husband travels to California for legitimate corporate business. She has absolutely no idea he is playing house with a spoiled heiress in San Francisco. DeAndre only married you, Penelope, to gain proximity to the Thorne family trust. He needed a wealthy, gullible family to act as a guarantor for his fraudulent loans, and you gladly handed him the keys to the castle without asking a single question. Penelope's eyes darted frantically from the marriage certificate lying on the table to DeAndre's face. She was searching for a denial, waiting for him to laugh and tell her this was all a massive, ridiculous misunderstanding. But DeAndre looked away, unable to meet her gaze. The horrific betrayal finally snapped the last remaining thread of Penelope's fragile sanity. With a guttural, animalistic scream, she lunged at him. She slapped him hard across the face, her diamond rings leaving deep, bleeding red scratches across his cheek. She pounded her fists against his chest, screaming obscenities completely oblivious to the crowd of wealthy socialites recording the violent spectacle on their smartphones. "You liar! You broke me! You ruined my life!" she wailed, clawing wildly at his neck. DeAndre had finally had enough. The terrified scammer was instantly replaced by a furious, cornered animal. He forcefully grabbed Penelope by the wrists and shoved her backward with tremendous force. She stumbled hard, her high designer heels catching on the thick, expensive rug, and crashed into the adjacent empty table, sending silverware clattering to the floor. "You think I actually love you?" DeAndre yelled, his voice echoing through the opulent dining room like thunder. "You are a useless, whiny leech. I only tolerated your insufferable shopping sprees because I thought you were sitting on a gold mine. But you are broker than I am. You want me to pay the bills. With what money, Penelope? Our mansion was foreclosed on by the bank on Friday." Penelope collapsed onto the floor, her designer dress pooling around her as she sobbed uncontrollably into her hands. The reality of her impending poverty had finally broken her completely. DeAndre stood over her, breathing heavily, aggressively, adjusting his torn custom suit jacket, before giving the private security guards a wary, terrified glance and backing away slowly toward the wall. The restaurant's upscale ambiance felt surreal against the backdrop of their absolute destruction. Waiters stood frozen near the kitchen doors, unsure whether to intervene or simply watch the mighty Thorne family tear itself apart. My father watched the entire grotesque scene unfold with his mouth hanging wide open. The glittering empire he thought he had secured by betraying my mother was nothing but ash and smoke. He slowly turned his head away from his weeping stepdaughter and his fraudulent son-in-law, his panicked eyes finally locking onto me. I sat perfectly still, my posture straight, holding his gaze with absolute indifference. I could see the exact gears turning in his cowardly mind. Richard was a man who always looked for the easiest exit, the softest landing. For my entire life, Richard had let other people make the hard choices so he could keep his hands clean. Now there was no one left to hide behind. Right now I was the only person in the room holding the keys to any kind of financial salvation. "Bella," he whispered, his voice trembling as genuine tears welled up in his eyes. He reached across the white linen table, his hand shaking violently as he tried to grasp my fingers. I pulled my hand back smoothly, resting it firmly on the thick leather portfolio I had brought. He swallowed hard, letting his empty hand fall to the table. "Bella, please." You have to help me fix this. We are blood family. You are my biological daughter. You cannot just sit there and let these people destroy me. I am an old man. You are the only real family I have left. Blood family, I repeated, letting the words roll off my tongue like absolute poison. I stared at the pathetic man sitting across from me, feeling no sympathy, no warmth, no hesitation. Like the night I was in a severe car crash at 25A, drunk driver T-boned my cheap used sedan on the highway. I woke up in the intensive care unit with 3 broken ribs, a punctured lung, and a shattered collarbone. The hospital administration called you because I was still on your emergency contact list. Do you remember what you told them, Richard? My father flinched as if I had struck him, looking away toward the marble floor. I remember perfectly. I continued, raising my voice just enough to ensure the surrounding wealthy tables heard every single word. You told the billing department that you were too busy touring Hawaii with Cassandra to deal with my medical bills. You told the trauma nurses to put me on a state payment plan, and you hung up the phone. I spent 2 weeks in that hospital room entirely alone, terrified of the mounting medical debt, struggling to breathe, while you two were sipping cocktails on a luxury yacht paid for by my mother's money. So do not ever use the word family with me again. I unzipped the leather portfolio and pulled out a heavy, gold-plated fountain pen. I slapped it down onto the mahogany table with a sharp crack that made Richard physically jump in his seat. Then I withdrew 2 meticulously prepared legal documents, placing them side by side in front of him. You have a choice to make right now, I instructed, smoothly tapping the first document. This is a voluntary resignation letter. By signing this, you permanently relinquish all control, all voting rights, and all executive privileges regarding the Thorne family business and its associated corporate assets. You will walk away with the meager basic pension you accrued before DeAndre drained the primary executive accounts. It is barely enough to afford a modest 2-bedroom apartment in the suburbs, but it will keep a roof over your head and keep you out of the courtroom. I moved my index finger to the second document, which bore the official seal of a federal affidavit. This is a drafted criminal complaint addressed directly to the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Banking Commission. It details your direct complicity in DeAndre's wire fraud. As the primary account holder, your signature authorized the illegal transfer of those funds. My forensic accounting proves you showed willful negligence by failing to verify the collateral. I have tied your personal authorization codes directly to the fraudulent offshore wires. Richard was hyperventilating, now his chest heaving as he stared at the 2 pieces of paper as if they were live grenades. The color had completely vanished from his cheeks. Sign away the company to keep your pathetic little pension, I ordered, my voice dropping to an icy, commanding whisper. Or refuse, and I will hand this complaint to the federal agents who are currently tearing apart DeAndre's downtown office. You will go to federal prison for corporate fraud, and you will die in a concrete cell. You have exactly 60 seconds to decide. I raised my wrist, looking pointedly at the silver watch my mother had given me for my high school graduation. The seconds began to tick away loudly in the tense silence of our table. Bella, you cannot do this, Richard pleaded, thick tears streaming down his wrinkled cheeks, ruining his perfectly groomed appearance. I am your father. I gave you life. You cannot send me to prison. 45 seconds, I replied without looking up from the watch face. He looked around the restaurant wildly, desperately searching for any sign of mercy, any loophole or escape route. But there was absolutely none. The private security guards stood firm by the exits. The elite patrons were watching him with utter disgust. His perfect trophy wife was hyperventilating in her chair, and his spoiled stepdaughter was still a sobbing mess on the floor. He was completely, utterly trapped by his own decades of cowardice and greed. 30 seconds, I announced, my tone completely unwavering. Richard let out a broken, pathetic sob that echoed across the dining room. He reached out with a trembling hand, his fingers hovering nervously over the gold-plated fountain pen. He knew he had lost. He knew I had outsmarted them all, using the very legal and financial systems they thought they controlled to orchestrate their ultimate downfall. He picked up the pen, his knuckles turning white as he moved it toward the voluntary resignation letter. Suddenly, Cassandra lunged forward from her seat, like a striking viper. She slammed her hand down onto the resignation document, pinning it flat to the table before Richard could press the pen to the paper. Her face was contorted into a terrifying mask of pure, unadulterated desperation and rage. "Richard, stop!" Cassandra shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly across the entire dining room, shattering the last remnants of her high society grace. "If you sign away that company and leave me with nothing but a basic pension, I swear to God I will drag you down with me. If you sign that paper, I will personally hand over the proof of your 7 years of tax evasion to the feds." Richard's face morphed from absolute terror into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The cowardly man who had spent a decade hiding behind my mother's wealth and Cassandra's ruthless social maneuvering finally snapped. He violently shoved Cassandra's hand off the table, sending her heavy diamond bracelet scraping against the wood. "Tax evasion!" Richard bellowed, spit flying from his lips as he completely abandoned any remaining shred of country club decorum. "You are going to blackmail me with tax evasion, you arrogant, delusional gold digger. Who do you think set up those shell companies in the Cayman Islands? The IRS is going to be fascinated to learn about the $3 million you siphoned from the estate's maintenance fund to pay for your secret gambling debts in Monaco." Cassandra recoiled, her meticulously contoured face twisting into an ugly sneer. "You gave me that money," she shrieked, pointing a manicured nail right between his eyes. "You transferred those funds to keep me quiet after I found out about your affair with that 20-something paralegal in Chicago. Do not pretend you are some innocent victim, Richard. I have the bank routing numbers saved on a flash drive. If I am going down for DeAndre's wire fraud, I am dragging you straight to hell with me. I will tell the federal prosecutors exactly how you undervalued Helen's primary assets to avoid the estate tax before she was even cold in the ground." The restaurant descended into an electrifying, horrified silence. The clinking of expensive silverware and the soft hum of the grand piano had completely ceased. Every single wealthy patron at Le Jardin People Cassandra had spent years desperately trying to impress sat frozen in their chairs, eagerly absorbing the spectacular implosion of the Thorne family. Penelope was still sitting on the floor clutching her ruined designer dress, weeping loudly as her mother and stepfather ruthlessly tore each other to pieces. DeAndre remained pressed against the far wall, guarded by my private security, looking like a man marching toward the gallows. I calmly reached out and picked up my crystal flute, taking a slow, refreshing sip of my chilled mimosa. With my free hand, I picked up my smartphone from the table. The screen glowed brightly, displaying the red recording circle ticking away the seconds. I held the device up high, ensuring the microphone caught every single word echoing off the restaurant's high ceilings. "Please keep going," I announced, my voice carrying a cheerful melodic tone that sliced right through their screaming match. "I am capturing excellent audio quality. The Internal Revenue Service loves voluntary confessions, especially when they involve offshore accounts and premeditated tax evasion. The federal prosecutors are going to have a field day with this recording." Richard and Cassandra froze mid-sentence. They turned their heads toward me simultaneously, their eyes locking onto the glowing red recording screen. The sheer magnitude of their own stupidity crashed down upon them. In their frantic, selfish desperation to save themselves, they had just publicly confessed to multiple federal felonies on a silver platter, providing me with the exact ammunition I needed to guarantee their total destruction. Richard dropped his head into his hands, pulling at his thinning hair as he let out a pathetic groan of defeat. Cassandra, however, shifted into pure survival mode. The realization that she was utterly trapped with her fraudulent son-in-law facing the FBI and her husband facing the IRS triggered a frantic, breathless panic. She lunged for her designer handbag, her hands shaking so violently she could barely open the gold clasp. She pulled out her phone, her manicured fingers slipping on the screen as she frantically scrolled through her elite contacts list. "I need cash," Cassandra muttered feverishly to herself, pacing back and forth next to the table. "I just need a bridge loan. If I can wire the bank enough to cover the immediate margin call on the mansion, I can stall the foreclosure. I can hire a defense attorney to block the audio recording. I just need one of my board members to front me the cash." She pressed the phone to her ear, tapping her designer heel rapidly against the floor. "Hello, Beatrice? It is Cassandra. Listen, I am in a bit of a liquidity bind, and I need a quick transfer of 200,000. The line clicked dead. Cassandra gasped, staring at the screen in disbelief. She quickly dialed another number. Catherine, please, you have to help me. I need a short-term loan. Catherine hung up immediately. Cassandra dialed frantically, calling the wives of venture capitalists, real estate tycoons, and tech CEOs she had spent years kissing up to. Every single one of them disconnected the call the second they heard her desperate, pleading voice. Word of DeAndre's fraudulent crypto collapse and the Thorne family's public meltdown was already spreading through the country club group chats like wildfire. In the ruthless world of high society, financial contagion was the ultimate sin, and Cassandra had just become entirely radioactive. No one was going to throw a life preserver to a woman actively sinking into a federal indictment. Nobody is answering. Cassandra whimpered, her voice cracking as she stared at her phone screen. They are all ignoring my calls. They are acting like I do not exist. Welcome to my world for the past 10 years, I replied coldly, setting my mimosa glass down on the table. You reap exactly what you sow. Before Cassandra could attempt another pathetic phone call, the heavy atmosphere in the room shifted again. The general manager of Le Jardin, a man known for his impeccable discretion and absolute intolerance for any unseemly public disturbances, approached our table with quiet authority. His face was carved from stone, his posture rigid and unyielding. 2 large restaurant security guards flanked him, their eyes locked firmly on Richard and Cassandra. Mrs. Belmont, the manager said, his voice dripping with icy professionalism. He held out a sleek black leather checkbook presenter, snapping it open to reveal a stack of premium credit cards. I have attempted to process the payment for your private Mother's Day brunch. Your primary titanium black card was declined. Cassandra's jaw dropped. That is impossible. She stammered, her cheeks burning with fresh humiliation. Run it again. It has no limit. I ran it 3 full times, the manager replied, his tone devoid of any sympathy. I also attempted to run the 3 backup corporate cards you provided on file. All of them were instantly rejected and flagged by the issuer as fraudulent. Given the extraordinary disruption you and your guests have caused in my dining room today, my patience has entirely evaporated. If you cannot pay this $4,000 brunch tab immediately, I am calling the police to have you arrested. Cassandra gasped, her manicured hands trembling so violently she could barely hold her jewel-encrusted clutch. She flipped the designer bag upside down, dumping its contents directly onto the ruined white tablecloth. Expensive gold-plated lipsticks, a compact mirror, designer mints, and valet tickets scattered across the mahogany wood, clattering against the silverware. But there was not a single dollar bill. For all her posturing, for all her endless bragging about immense wealth and superior status, Cassandra Belmont did not carry actual cash. She lived entirely on the illusion of limitless credit, and that credit had just been completely and irrevocably obliterated. Penelope was sobbing hysterically now, her mascara running down her cheeks in thick black streaks as she rocked back and forth on the restaurant floor. DeAndre let out a muffled groan, still pinned securely to his chair by my private security contractors, unable to move a single inch. My father, Richard, had simply buried his face in his hands, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his public downfall. The glittering facade they had presented to the world was peeling away, exposing the rot underneath. The restaurant manager stood firm, his expression entirely devoid of mercy. I will give you exactly 2 minutes to produce a valid form of payment. Mrs. Belmont? He stated, his voice ringing with absolute finality. After that, the authorities will handle this theft of services. I sat back and watched them squirm. This was the exact family that had mocked me for working for a living. They called me a junk dealer. They laughed when I took extra shifts at the appraisal firm during my 20s, working late into the night, verifying the provenance of antique estates just so I could pay off my own student loans. They sneered at my practical clothes and my modest apartment, firmly believing that my independence was a sign of absolute failure. But my independence was real. Every single dollar I had was backed by my own blood, sweat, and relentless dedication. I slowly reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out my wallet. The sound of the zipper opening seemed incredibly loud in the suffocating tension of the dining room. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, immaculate stack of crisp $100 bills. It was cash I had withdrawn earlier that week after successfully liquidating a minor asset from an estate sale I managed. It was the physical manifestation of my hard work, my expertise, and my undeniable success. I calmly counted out 40 bills, the crisp paper snapping sharply between my fingers. One by one, I laid the $100 bills in a neat, perfect stack on the edge of the table. I looked directly into the manager's eyes and slid the stack of cash toward him. This covers my portion of the brunch, their final meal as members of high society, and a very generous tip for your staff to deal with this horrific mess, I announced smoothly. The manager's cold demeanor instantly melted into a respectful nod. He swiftly collected the cash, placing it securely in his leather presenter. "Thank you very much, Ms. Thorne," he replied courteously. "Your generosity is greatly appreciated. We will ensure the rest of your afternoon remains undisturbed." He signaled to the waiters, who immediately stepped back, leaving my ruined family completely isolated in their own spectacular disgrace. The reality of what had just occurred rippled through the dining room like a shockwave. I glanced around and saw exactly what Cassandra feared more than federal prison. The elite socialites, the wives of hedge fund managers and tech billionaires she had spent a decade desperately trying to impress, were not looking away. They were actively holding up their smartphones. Camera lenses were pointed directly at our table. I recognized Beatrice, the president of Cassandra's exclusive country club, openly recording a video with a look of pure, unadulterated, gleeful malice on her face. Cassandra realized it too. She looked around the room, making eye contact with the women who had once kissed her cheek and invited her to charity galas. Now they were documenting her absolute social annihilation. She was the woman who had to be bailed out by the stepdaughter she relentlessly abused. In the ruthless, predatory ecosystem of American high society, there was no recovering from this. She was permanently exiled, instantly transformed into a laughingstock, a viral cautionary tale of fake wealth and staggering humiliation. I smoothly pushed my chair back and stood up, smoothing the front of my silk blouse. I slung my leather tote bag over my shoulder and looked down at the pathetic group of people I used to call my family. "Enjoy the rest of your Mother's Day," I said casually. "I have a meeting with my Delaware trust attorneys in an hour to finalize your formal eviction from my property." I turned my back and took my first step toward the exit. Suddenly I felt a desperate, clawing weight grabbing the hem of my trench coat. I stopped and looked down. Cassandra Belmont, the woman who had proudly paraded into my mother's funeral to steal her life, had dropped entirely to her knees, right there on the restaurant floor. Her designer dress pooled around her legs. Her immaculate hair was disheveled and tears of pure terror streamed down her face. She clung to my coat with a white-knuckled grip. "Please!" Bella, Cassandra begged, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical sob. "I am begging you, do not throw us out into the street. We have absolutely nowhere to go. You cannot do this to Penelope. She is your sister. She is 4 months pregnant." The entire dining room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if the mention of an innocent unborn child would finally crack my ironclad resolve. Penelope sniffled loudly from the floor, clutching her stomach, desperately trying to play the ultimate victim card. I did not flinch. I did not soften. I leaned down slowly, bringing my face just inches away from Cassandra's tear-streaked, desperate expression. I looked directly into her terrified eyes, ensuring my voice was low enough for her to hear, but perfectly pitched, so the microphone on my recording phone caught the exact exchange. I leaned in and whispered a terrifying biological fact right into her ear. I kept my voice dead level as I let the words slip past my lips. "Your brilliant, wealthy son-in-law had a fully documented vasectomy in Chicago 4 years ago, long before he ever met your daughter." Cassandra froze, her tear-streaked face turning an alarming shade of gray. Her grip on my trench coat loosened instantly, as her brain scrambled to process the absolute impossibility of her daughter's much-flaunted pregnancy. I did not give her a chance to recover. I stood up completely straight, smoothing the lapels of my coat, and turned my attention to the man still pinned to his chair by my security guards. DeAndre, I announced, projecting my voice loudly enough to cut through the hushed murmurs of the wealthy patrons eagerly watching our table. Cassandra was just begging me not to kick you all out into the street because Penelope is 4 months pregnant. But since my background check uncovered your medical records from your primary care physician in Illinois, I have a genuine question. You might want to ask your legally married wife, Clarissa, if that vasectomy you got 4 years ago was reversible. So DeAndre, whose baby is Penelope, actually carrying. The silence that slammed into the dining room was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick carpet. Penelope let out a shrill, blood-curdling shriek, scrambling backward across the floor like a terrified crab trying to escape a predator. The sheer horror in her eyes confirmed everything. DeAndre went entirely rigid. The veins in his thick neck bulged against his torn shirt collar. He slowly turned his head to look at Penelope, his eyes wide with a terrifying, unhinged realization. The fake cryptocurrency millionaire had just realized he was being played by a woman he was actively scamming. The sheer irony was poetic, but DeAndre was not in the mood for poetry. "You cheated on me!" DeAndre roared, his voice echoing violently off the crystal chandeliers. He violently shoved his heavy dining chair backward, ripping his arms free from the security guards, in a sudden burst of pure adrenaline-fueled rage. With the tennis coach, "You have been sleeping with that 20-something kid from the country club while I was busy funding your pathetic lifestyle." Penelope scrambled to her feet, holding her hands up defensively. "It was a mistake," she wailed, backing into a dessert cart and sending a silver tray of pastries crashing to the floor. "You were never home, DeAndre. You were always traveling to Chicago for business." He lunged at her. He bypassed the fallen dessert cart and grabbed Penelope by the shoulders of her ruined Chanel dress, shaking her so violently her diamond earrings went flying across the room. "You absolute parasite!" DeAndre bellowed, completely losing his mind. "I risked federal wire fraud to buy you a Porsche, and you are carrying the tennis coach's bastard child." Absolute chaos erupted in Le Jardin. High society patrons scrambled out of their chairs, grabbing their expensive coats and rushing toward the walls to avoid the brawl. My private security contractors immediately sprang into action, tackling DeAndre from behind and wrestling him to the marble floor to separate him from a hysterical Penelope. Cassandra screamed, crawling on her hands and knees toward the scuffle, completely stripped of her dignity. Richard stood frozen by the table, clutching his chest, watching his entire legacy burn to the ground in a spectacular inferno of betrayal and violence. I stood perfectly still, watching the violent culmination of their greed. I did not lift a finger to help them. They had built this house of cards entirely on their own, and gravity was finally collecting its massive debt. Suddenly, the heavy glass front doors of the restaurant burst open with explosive force. A dozen men and women wearing tactical vests adorned with bold yellow FBI and SEC lettering swarmed into the elegant dining room. The lead agent, a tall man with a severe buzz cut and a badge hanging around his neck, held up a federal warrant. "Nobody move!" The agent shouted, his voice commanding absolute authority over the chaotic room. "Federal agents." Two agents immediately rushed the struggling pile on the floor. They pulled DeAndre off the marble, slamming him hard against a pillar. "DeAndre Jenkins, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, bank fraud, and identity theft," an agent recited coldly, slapping heavy steel handcuffs onto his wrists. DeAndre stopped fighting, his head dropping in absolute defeat as the cold metal locked into place. A female agent marched directly toward Cassandra, who was still kneeling on the floor, weeping over Penelope. "Cassandra Belmont," the agent announced, pulling Cassandra roughly to her feet. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and aiding and abetting federal financial crimes." Cassandra thrashed wildly, her perfect hair flying in every direction as the agent secured her wrists behind her back. "You cannot do this!" she shrieked, her voice echoing with pure panic. "I am a victim. He lied to me, Richard. Tell them. Tell them I did not know." But Richard could not help her. He was too busy backing away from the table, his eyes darting frantically toward the kitchen exit. He thought he could slip away in the confusion. He thought he could abandon his wife and his stepdaughter, just like he had abandoned me at the hospital 10 years ago. The lead agent stepped directly into Richard's path, blocking his only route of escape. "Richard Thorne," the agent asked, his tone devoid of any mercy. Richard swallowed hard, nodding weakly. "Yes," he choked out. "But I had nothing to do with the crypto fraud. I was manipulated. I am just a retired executive. I am not here for the wire fraud, Mr. Thorne," the lead agent replied, pulling a separate document from his jacket pocket. "I am here on behalf of the Internal Revenue Service. You are under arrest for 7 counts of federal tax evasion and international money laundering." Richard's knees buckled. 2 agents grabbed him by the arms, holding him upright as they began to read him his Miranda rights. The wealthy patrons watched in stunned silence as the patriarch of the Thorne family was publicly handcuffed. Richard looked across the room, his desperate, terrified eyes locking onto mine. "Bella, please!" Richard begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic sob as the agents dragged him toward the exit. "Call the corporate lawyers. Tell them to freeze the accounts. You have to save me. Bella, you are my daughter." I looked at the man who had traded my mother's life for a cheap illusion of high society power. I slowly raised my hand, holding up my smartphone. The screen was still brightly illuminated, showing the active audio recording of his entire loud, detailed confession about offshore tax evasion from just 10 minutes ago. I simply smiled, gave him a small, cheerful wave, and tapped the screen to save the audio file. "I will be sure to forward this voluntary confession directly to the prosecuting attorney, Richard Wise," called out, my voice ringing with absolute clarity across the ruined dining room. "Consider it my final contribution to the family business." Exactly 24 hours later, the opulent crystal chandeliers of the Michelin star restaurant were replaced by the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights of the Federal Building in downtown San Francisco. I sat in a sterile interrogation room, sipping terrible black coffee from a paper cup. I was not a suspect. I was their star cooperating witness. The heavy metal door clicked open, and Special Agent Davis walked in, carrying a thick stack of manila folders. He tossed them onto the steel table and rubbed his tired eyes. "Your father is currently weeping in Interrogation Room B," Davis announced, taking a seat across from me. "He is frantically trying to pin every single financial crime on his wife. He claims he is just a naive, retired old man who was hopelessly manipulated by a greedy, calculating woman. He says Cassandra orchestrated the entire offshore money laundering operation entirely behind his back, and he just blindly signed the tax returns because he trusted her." I set my coffee cup down and let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Richard always plays the victim when the bill comes due," I replied, my voice echoing slightly in the bare room. "But his defense strategy relies on him being ignorant of the asset transfers. Fortunately for your investigation, ignorance is impossible to claim when you actively participate in the physical procurement of fraudulent goods." I reached down to the floor and lifted my heavy leather briefcase, placing it squarely on the metal table. I unzipped the main compartment and pulled out 3 massive, meticulously organized appraisal portfolios. As a high-end estate appraiser, my entire career is dedicated to authenticating historical assets, tracing their legitimate provenance, and establishing their true market value. Over the past few months, while finalizing the execution of the Delaware Quiet Trust, I conducted a comprehensive stealth inventory of the Thorne estate. I slid the first thick binder toward Agent Davis. Cassandra spent the last decade claiming she was curating a world-class collection of historical artifacts for the mansion. She expensed over $12 million from the corporate accounts under the guise of fine art procurement. She told the country club she was preserving history. Agent Davis opened the binder, his eyes scanning the detailed photographs and complex analytical reports I had compiled. "Turn to page 40, I instructed smoothly. "That is a supposedly authentic 18th century Ming Dynasty vase. Cassandra expensed it for $400,000. I ran a microscopic material analysis on the ceramic glaze. It contains synthetic polymers that were not invented until 1994. It was mass-produced in a modern overseas factory and is worth perhaps $50 at a local flea market." I flipped to another secure tab, pointing to a photograph of a massive ornate wooden wardrobe. That is billed as a priceless Louis XV armoire imported directly from a private chateau in France. Cost to the estate was documented at $800,000. The wood is medium-density fiberboard, wrapped in an expensive veneer held together by industrial staple guns. It is entirely fake. Agent Davis stared at the reports, a slow whistle escaping his lips. They were fencing fake art. No, I corrected him, tapping the financial routing summaries I had attached to the back of the binder. You do not fence fake art for millions. You use fake art to justify enormous outgoing international wire transfers. Cassandra was purchasing cheap replicas, falsifying the appraisal documents, and wiring millions of dollars to dummy art dealerships in the Cayman Islands. Those dummy corporations are the exact shell companies Richard was bragging about at the restaurant yesterday. And the most damning part for my father, I pulled out a stack of federal customs declarations. Richard personally signed every single import document for these fake antiques. He cannot claim Cassandra manipulated him into offshore money laundering when his signature is legally bound to the physical transport of the fraudulent assets used to conceal the cash. Agent Davis gathered the binders, a look of profound satisfaction washing over his face. You just handed us the smoking gun for international smuggling and money laundering, Isabella. This elevates their charges to a mandatory minimum of 25 years in federal prison. I am taking this straight to Cassandra right now. Let us see how long her loyalty to your father lasts when she realizes she is staring at a quarter of a century behind bars. The agent left the room, locking the heavy door behind him. I sat alone in the quiet interrogation room, feeling a deep, resonating sense of vindication. The financial trap had closed perfectly. Nearly 2 hours passed. The air conditioning hummed steadily in the background. I waited patiently, knowing that in the adjacent rooms the federal agents were ruthlessly dismantling the last pathetic remnants of my family's defenses. Stripped of her designer clothes, wearing a standard-issue gray jumpsuit, Cassandra was finally facing the unvarnished reality of her actions. When the heavy metal door opened again, Agent Davis stepped inside. His professional satisfaction was entirely gone. His face was chalky white, and he looked physically ill. He stood rigidly by the table, holding a freshly printed transcript in his trembling hand. What happened? I asked, straightening up immediately. She demanded full federal immunity. Davis replied, his voice uncharacteristically hoarse. Confronted with your appraisal reports, she realized Richard was throwing her under the bus. Staring at decades in prison, she panicked and demanded a deal. She offered us something far bigger than financial fraud. Agent Davis slowly slid the paper across the metal table. Cassandra confessed to murder Isabella. I stared at the stark black ink. 10 years ago, my mother Helen did not die of a sudden tragic cardiac event. The transcript revealed that when Helen suffered a massive heart attack, Richard and Cassandra were in the bedroom. They intentionally hid her emergency heart medication, standing over her and ruthlessly watching her die in pure agony to accelerate the inheritance. I stared at the black ink on the transcript. The words blurred as the crushing weight of Cassandra's confession slammed into my chest. Financial greed was one thing. A calculated execution was an entirely different universe of pure evil. For 10 years I had mourned my mother, believing her heart simply gave out. I carried the profound grief of her sudden passing completely unaware. Her final moments were spent gasping for air, while her husband and his mistress stood over her. They had deliberately hidden the emergency medication that would have saved her life, watching her die in agony just to accelerate their inheritance. Agent Davis watched me carefully from across the table, likely expecting a hysterical breakdown. He did not know that grief, when compressed under a decade of systematic emotional abuse, transforms into solid diamond. I did not shed a single tear. I slowly slid the transcript back across the metal table. I want a certified copy of that confession immediately, I told him, my voice carrying a lethal stillness that made the seasoned federal agent swallow hard. I walked out of the federal building and dialed my lead corporate attorney. Financial ruin was no longer sufficient for my father. I wanted absolute destruction. Within the hour, my elite legal team drafted and filed a civil wrongful death lawsuit against Richard and Cassandra. In the United States legal system, a pending federal murder investigation allows a plaintiff to file an emergency ex parte injunction. The federal judge signed our petition without hesitation. That signature acted as a swift financial guillotine. It instantly froze the last untouchable remnants of Richard's assets, including his offshore holdings, luxury vehicles, and protected state pensions. Every cent he possessed was locked into a permanent legal freeze until the wrongful death suit was settled. Richard Thorne was officially penniless. While I dismantled the final pillars of my father's fraudulent empire, Penelope staged her own pathetic rebellion. Kicked out of high society circles and abandoned by her fraudulent husband, DeAndre, Penelope found herself homeless. Her backup credit cards were declined everywhere. But the golden child refused to accept reality. Driven by pure entitlement, Penelope hired a roadside locksmith to break the backdoor lock of the Thorne estate. She dragged her designer suitcases back into the master suite, convinced she could exploit a loophole in California tenant law to claim squatters' rights. She believed because her license still listed the mansion as her primary residence, local police would be forced to let her stay, while the eviction crawled through backlogged housing courts. She planned to sit comfortably in my mother's house, forcing me into a drawn-out legal battle just to remove her. She severely underestimated the ironclad power of the Delaware Quiet Trust. The exact moment she breached the perimeter, my private security contractors alerted my phone. I simply drove straight to the estate accompanied by 2 armed county sheriffs. Penelope was lounging comfortably on the outdoor patio in a silk robe, sipping expensive bottled water she raided from the pantry when I confidently walked through the heavy iron gates. She stood up immediately, wearing a triumphant smirk. "You cannot touch me, Isabella," Penelope shouted across the manicured lawn. "I looked it up online. I am a legal resident here. You have to give me a formal 30-day notice and take me to housing court. I am not going anywhere until a judge forces me out." I smiled warmly, holding up a thick binder containing the certified Delaware Trust documentation. "I am not here to evict you today, Penelope," I replied cheerfully. "As the sole legal trustee and registered owner of this property, I am simply here to exercise my absolute legal right to terminate all auxiliary services to the estate." I signaled to the utility technicians waiting in the service trucks parked behind the sheriff's cruisers. Within 60 seconds, the main electrical breaker was pulled and locked. The municipal water valve was bolted completely shut. The natural gas lines were permanently capped. The massive estate instantly went completely dark and entirely silent. The heated outdoor pool immediately began to cool. The centralized climate control systems shut down completely. "You cannot do that," Penelope shrieked, her smug confidence instantly vaporizing as the harsh reality of living in an unpowered concrete box set in. "I just did," I answered smoothly, turning my back on her. "Enjoy your squatter's rights in the pitch-black freezing cold without a working toilet or warm shower." Penelope ran frantically down the driveway, screaming hysterically at the sheriffs to arrest me, but they simply pointed to my legal paperwork and warned her against trespassing on the utility boxes. She was trapped in a nightmare of her own, making utterly stranded behind the iron gates of an estate that had just become a beautiful freezing tomb. Suddenly, a sleek red sports car pulled up to the curb right behind my vehicle. Penelope's tear-streaked face lit up with relief. It was her secret lover, the athletic tennis coach she had been sleeping with behind DeAndre's back. "Oh, thank God." Penelope sobbed loudly, rushing toward the wrought iron gates and reaching her desperate hands through the metal bars. "You came to save me. Get me out of this place. Take me to your apartment right now." The tennis coach did not open the passenger door. He did not offer her a comforting smile. Instead, he stepped out of his car holding a manila envelope. He walked right up to the iron gates, ignoring her tears, and shoved the envelope directly into Penelope's shaking hands. "I am not here to save you, Penelope," he said, his voice dripping with cold greed. "My lawyer said you come from a massive trust fund family with millions in liquid assets. I just filed a paternity lawsuit against you. Since you are the rich one in this relationship, I am suing you for full primary custody of the child and $10,000 a month in child support." Penelope's wails echo down the quiet suburban street as the red sports car speeds away without her. She is left standing alone on the cold pavement with nothing but her designer luggage and a massive impending child support battle. I lock the heavy iron gates of my newly reclaimed estate, get into my car, and leave her shivering in the freezing darkness. The immediate squatter issue is permanently resolved. Early the next morning, my phone rings. It is Agent Davis from the Federal Bureau. He asked me to come down to the field office immediately. There has been a massive break in the case. DeAndre Jenkins, facing 20 hard years in a federal lockup for wire fraud, realized his new high society family had entirely abandoned him. Knowing Penelope was completely broke and Richard was actively preparing to pin the entire financial conspiracy on his shoulders, DeAndre did exactly what any cornered scammer would do to save his own skin. He bypassed his expensive defense team and took a sweeping federal plea deal. I arrive at the federal building and sit across from Agent Davis in the same sterile interrogation room. He slides a thick stack of printed emails and complex banking ledgers across the metal desk. In exchange for a reduced sentence of 5 years, DeAndre surrendered his highly encrypted personal hard drives. Because DeAndre was so deeply embedded in the family finances, he had quietly backed up a decade of Richard and Cassandra's deleted digital communications as an insurance policy. Agent Davis points to a specific folder sitting on the very top of the stack. It has my full name printed on the tab. As a high-end estate appraiser, I spend my entire professional life tracing hidden assets, verifying historical provenance, and establishing absolute financial truth. I know exactly how to read a complex ledger. My eyes quickly scan the banking codes, the offshore routing numbers, and the corresponding transaction dates. My blood runs completely cold. The betrayal goes far deeper than the recent wire fraud and fake antiques. This particular crime goes back exactly 15 years. Right before I graduated high school with top honors, Richard sat me down in his lavish study and tearfully explained that my entire college fund had been wiped out by a sudden market crash. He told me I had to take out predatory student loans if I wanted to get a decent education. I spent my entire 20s working grueling night shifts at appraisal firms, eating cheap noodles, and suffocating under mountains of crushing debt while my family lived in absolute luxury. But the financial market did not crash. Richard actively embezzled $250,000 directly from my protected educational trust. The decrypted ledgers show the money was wired directly to an underground gambling syndicate in Las Vegas. He stole my future to pay off Cassandra's massive secret baccarat debts right before they made their affair public. He sacrificed his own daughter's education to keep his mistress out of trouble with violent loan sharks. I drive straight to the county jail where Richard is currently being held without bail. I sit in the bleak gray visitation room waiting behind the thick reinforced glass. The heavy metal door clangs open and Richard shuffles into the booth wearing an oversized orange jumpsuit. He sits down heavily and picks up the heavy plastic receiver. Instantly, the pathetic performance begins. He squeezes his eyes shut, forcing out fake tears to garner sympathy. Bella, he sobs, his voice cracking with manufactured grief. I am so sorry. Cassandra had a terrible addiction. The loan sharks threatened her life. I was desperate to protect the family name from a terrible scandal. I had absolutely no choice but to use those funds to save us. I do not offer a single ounce of sympathy. I pull a printed banking receipt from my portfolio and press the text flat against the glass pane. You did not just pay off her gambling debts, I state coldly, watching his fake tears instantly vanish. The wire transfer clearly shows you stole an additional $100,000 from my education fund. You used my tuition money to buy a luxury yacht registered under a fake corporate name. You sailed that yacht to Hawaii the exact same week I was lying in a hospital bed with a punctured lung from a car crash, wondering how I would ever pay my mounting medical bills. Richard drops the weeping father act entirely. The cowardice evaporates, replaced by a disgusting, arrogant smirk. He leans back in his hard plastic chair, his eyes gleaming with malicious pride. You can take the house, Isabella, he sneers through the phone, tapping the glass with a dirty fingernail. You can put me in this miserable cell for a few years. But I still win. My offshore Cayman Islands pension is completely untouchable by United States civil judgments. When I get out of this minimum security joke of a prison, I am flying straight to the Caribbean. I will live the rest of my life sipping expensive rum on a private white sand beach while you work yourself to death appraising old furniture for ungrateful clients. I maintain a perfectly blank expression, letting his sickening arrogance reach its absolute peak. I reach into my leather briefcase and pull out one final devastating document. I slide a legally certified, expertly translated decree bearing the official stamp of the Cayman Islands Financial Monetary Authority directly against the glass for him to read. You might want to rethink your tropical retirement plan, Richard, I whisper. When you commit federal wire fraud and use offshore assets as illegal leverage, international firewalls collapse. Under the Patriot Act, your untouchable pension was completely frozen at dawn. His smug smile shatters into pure panic. The game is over. He is trapped completely penniless and staring at a bleak future inside a concrete cell. I calmly hang up the heavy plastic phone receiver. Through the thick reinforced glass, Richard stares at the translated Cayman Islands legal decree pressed against the window. His smug expression dissolves into a mask of pure terror. He slams his fists against the glass, his mouth moving frantically as he gestures for me to pick the phone back up. I let him panic for 10 agonizing seconds, watching the sweat bead on his forehead before I slowly lift the receiver back to my ear. How he gasps, his voice cracking into a high pitch of total desperation. That account was sovereign. It was legally untouchable. You cannot just freeze international assets. I can. When you make incredibly arrogant mistakes, I reply smoothly, my voice cold and precise. As a high-end estate appraiser, I work alongside the most ruthless forensic asset investigators in the country. When I looked into your financial portfolio, I noticed you did not just use my mother's estate to secure DeAndre's fraudulent loans. You needed to show massive liquidity to satisfy the federal bank underwriters. So you used your hidden Cayman funds as unlisted leverage for the domestic loan. Richard stops breathing, his eyes widening as the reality of his fatal error sets in. The moment you cross-collateralized an offshore account with a fraudulent United States bank loan, you voided the international firewall. I explain, savoring the absolute destruction of his retirement fantasy. Under the Patriot Act, any foreign asset used to facilitate domestic financial fraud is immediately subject to federal seizure. The United States government flagged the transaction the second DeAndre's firm collapsed. Your untouchable pension was seized by the Department of Justice at dawn. You have $0 to your name, Richard. Nothing. The finality of the word strikes him like a physical blow. Richard drops the phone receiver. It dangles by its metal cord, swinging back and forth against the glass. He clutches his chest, his fingers digging into the orange fabric of his jail uniform. His breathing becomes shallow and erratic. He falls to his knees, gasping for air, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple as a severe panic attack overtakes him. He wanted to spend his golden years sipping rum on a white sand beach. Instead, he will spend them in the bleak, terrifying reality of a concrete cell with absolutely no financial leverage to protect him. Two correctional officers rush into the visitation booth, grabbing him by the arms to stabilize his shaking body. I do not stay to watch the medical intervention. I place the Cayman decree back into my leather briefcase, turn my back on my father, and walk out of the county jail without a single ounce of regret. 48 hours later, I am stepping out of a black town car onto the bustling pavement of Wall Street. The towering skyscrapers of Manhattan cast long shadows across the financial district. I walk into the sleek marble lobby of one of the most elite corporate law firms in the world. The air up here on the 60th floor smells of polished mahogany and high-stakes power. I am escorted into a massive boardroom boasting panoramic views of the New York harbor. A team of 6 highly specialized corporate attorneys sits waiting for me, their briefcases open and documents neatly aligned. We are here to officially execute the final transfer of the Delaware Quiet Trust. My mother Helen had engineered this failsafe perfectly. With Richard legally stripped of his life estate privileges due to his fraudulent actions, the entire Thorne legacy now rightfully defaults to me. The lead attorney, a sharp man with silver hair and a tailored suit, slides a thick stack of finalized contracts across the polished table. Ms. Thorne, the attorney, says professionally, holding out a gold pen. With these signatures, you take undisputed ownership of the estate, the liquidated corporate assets, and the recovered investment portfolios. The federal government has also released the remaining legitimate funds back into your primary control. You are the sole executor and beneficiary. I take the pen. My hand does not shake. I sign my name on the dotted lines, each stroke of ink erasing a decade of financial abuse, emotional neglect, and systematic gaslighting. I am no longer the scapegoat they kicked out into the cold. I am the absolute master of the Thorne Empire. I review the final asset appraisal sheets attached to the trust. The sheer scale of the reclaimed wealth is staggering, but it represents justice rather than just money. Just as I place the pen down to seal the final contract, a loud, violent commotion erupts outside the heavy oak doors of the boardroom. I hear the sharp, defensive shouts of the receptionist, followed by the heavy thud of someone throwing their body against the frosted glass. The heavy double doors fly open, slamming against the walls. Two building security guards are actively wrestling with a disheveled, frantic woman, trying to drag her backward by her arms. It is Penelope. The golden child is entirely unrecognizable. Gone are the custom Chanel dresses, the flawless salon blowouts, and the pristine diamond jewelry. She is wearing a stained, oversized sweatshirt and cheap, scuffed sneakers. Her hair is matted, and she smells faintly of stale exhaust fumes and cheap bus station coffee. Penelope had somehow scraped together just enough loose change to buy a cross-country Greyhound bus ticket from California to New York, riding for days in misery just to crash this exact meeting. Isabella! Penelope screams, her voice raw and hoarse, as she fights against the security guards holding her back. You have to listen to me. Please, you have to tell them to let me go. The lead attorney stands up, outraged by the intrusion. Call the police immediately, he orders the guards. Wait, I say, raising my hand. I remain seated, looking at my stepsister with absolute icy detachment. Let her speak. The guards loosen their grip just enough for Penelope to stumble forward. She falls onto her knees right on the expensive boardroom carpet. She is shaking, tears streaming down her dirty face. The entitlement that defined her entire existence has been completely shattered by the brutal reality of actual poverty. Bella, I have absolutely nothing left, Penelope begs, clasping her hands together in a desperate plea. The tennis coach took all the money I had in my purse when he served me with the child support lawsuit. The shelters are completely full. I have not eaten a real meal in 3 days. I had to beg a stranger for bus fare just to get here. You just signed the papers. I know you have all the money now. You have millions. I am begging you, as your sister, just give me a monthly allowance. Just a few thousand a month. I cannot survive out there. I do not know how to work. You cannot let me starve in the streets. The elite lawyers stare at her in absolute disgust. I sit perfectly still, looking down at the woman who had happily thrown ice water in my face and mocked my career just weeks ago. Penelope stares back at me, her eyes wide with desperate, pathetic hope, waiting for me to write her a blank check. The pristine silence of the elite Manhattan boardroom was violently shattered by the sound of Penelope completely unraveling. All the carefully cultivated arrogance, the designer clothes, and the fake socialite bravado evaporated in a single second. The golden child of the Thorne family dropped hard onto her knees, her expensive shoes scraping uselessly against the expensive wool carpet. She began to sob openly, her body shaking with a pathetic, frantic energy that made the corporate attorneys recoil in mild disgust. I do not know how to work, Penelope wailed, her voice echoing off the mahogany walls as she clutched at the hem of my tailored trousers. I do not know how to cook a single meal. I do not know how to balance a checkbook, and I certainly cannot live without a trust fund. Everything I ever had was tied to our parents and my social standing. You cannot expect me to just survive out here like an ordinary person. I did not move away. I stood tall, looking down at my stepsister with absolute emotional detachment. I watched the tears stream down her face, refusing to offer a single word of comfort. Years ago, when I was forced out of the house at 18 with nothing but a backpack, and my sheer determination, Penelope had laughed from the comfort of her heated pool. She had mocked my struggles while living a life completely insulated from reality. Now the bill for her lifelong parasitism had finally come due, and she expected me to bail her out. "You are forgetting one very important detail, Penelope," I said, my voice cutting through her hysterical crying like a razor blade. "You are a mother, or at least you claim to be carrying a child. If you do not know how to work or survive, how on earth were you planning to raise a baby? Or was that just another manipulation tactic to trap a wealthy man like DeAndre?" Penelope's head snapped up, her eyes wide with a desperate, frantic panic. She saw that crying was not working, so she immediately pivoted to the oldest, most manipulative weapon in her arsenal. She slammed her hands against the carpet and pressed them flatly against her stomach, attempting to weaponize an unborn life to bend me to her will. "You have to help me for the sake of your niece or nephew," Penelope shrieked, her voice reaching a shrill, manic pitch. "I am pregnant, Isabella. Think about the baby. If I am out on the street with no money, no home, and no food, what do you think will happen to this innocent child? Are you really so heartless, so utterly devoid of family loyalty, that you would let an innocent baby suffer just to feed your own petty revenge?" The silence in the boardroom grew heavy. The elite corporate lawyers shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs, looking at me to see how I would handle the emotional blackmail. But they did not know my history. They did not know how many times Cassandra and Penelope had used fake tears and emotional extortion to steal what rightfully belonged to me. I did not blink. I did not flinch. Instead, I reached into my leather tote bag, pulled out a neat stack of papers I had printed that very morning, and tossed them down onto the carpet right in front of her kneeling form. "If you bothered to spend half as much time planning your future as you did planning your social calendar, you would not be in this mess," I stated coldly. "Take a look at those papers, Penelope." Penelope sniffled, her trembling fingers reaching out to pick up the documents scattered around her knees. She squinted down at the pages through her tear-blurred vision, expecting to see a legal settlement, or perhaps a check. Instead, what she held in her hands was a comprehensive printed list of minimum wage job openings across the 5 boroughs of New York City, complete with positions for retail associates, restaurant hostesses, and night shift inventory clerks. Attached to the back of the job listings was a detailed, highlighted map pointing the exact walking route to the nearest municipal women's shelter. "What is this?" Penelope gasped, staring up at me with sheer betrayal written across her tear-stained face. "You are giving me a job-hunting guide. You expect me to work behind a cash register. You expect me to sleep in a shelter with common criminals." I crossed my arms over my chest, letting out a sharp, cold breath. "Welcome to the real world, Penelope," I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality. "The exact world I have been living in since I was 18 years old, when your mother and my father threw me out into the snow with $200 and locked the doors behind me. You wanted independence. You wanted to prove you were better than everyone else. Now is your chance. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Go flip burgers, stock shelves, or do whatever the rest of humanity has to do to put food on the table. You are 30 years old. It is well past time you learned what an honest day's work actually feels like." The reality of my words slammed into Penelope with the force of a freight train. The realization that there was no secret inheritance coming to save her, no wealthy husband to bail her out, and no soft cushion of family privilege left to break her fall, completely snapped whatever fragile sanity she had left. The desperate victim act vanished instantly, replaced by a volcanic, unhinged rage. "You bitch!" Penelope screamed at the top of her lungs, scrambling up from her knees with sudden explosive energy. She grabbed a heavy ceramic coffee mug off the nearest mahogany side table and hurled it across the boardroom with all her might. The mug smashed violently against the wall, inches from the lead attorney's head, sending porcelain shards showering across the expensive carpet. "You think you have won? I will destroy you. I will ruin everything you built. You are nothing." Before Penelope could lunge toward the conference table to grab another projectile, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom burst open. Two massive, broad-shouldered building security guards, alerted by the commotion through the frosted glass, rushed into the room. They did not hesitate. They grabbed Penelope firmly by her upper arms, pinning her thrashing body securely between them as she shrieked obscenities and kicked her designer shoes wildly in the air. "Get your hands off me! Do you know who I am? I am a thorn!" Penelope roared, thrashing against the guards like a wild animal caught in a trap. "Let me go, Isabella. You will pay for this. You hear me? You will pay." The lead attorney adjusted his tie, his face pale with shock as he watched the screaming golden child being neutralized. "Please escort Ms. Belmont off the premises immediately," the attorney instructed the guards, his voice shaking slightly with residual adrenaline. "And make sure she is permanently banned from entering this corporate tower ever again. If she returns, call the NYPD." The guards nodded firmly. Without missing a beat, they lifted Penelope completely off the floor, carrying her kicking and screaming out of the boardroom, down the long marble hallway, and straight toward the elevators. Her frantic, muffled curses faded slowly into the distance until the heavy double doors automatically swung shut, plunging the room back into a tense, profound silence. I stood by the window, calmly smoothing out the lapels of my blazer and watching the yellow cabs crawl through the busy Manhattan traffic far below. The corporate lawyers let out a collective sigh of relief, beginning to gather their scattered papers and restore order to the meeting. The final legal pieces of the Thorn Empire were officially secured, and the toxic parasites who had bled it dry for a decade were finally entirely eradicated. Just as the lead attorney was handing me a clean pen to initial the final addendum of the trust transfer, my cell phone buzzed loudly against the polished mahogany table. I glanced down at the screen. The caller ID displayed a direct encrypted extension from the San Francisco field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. My heart gave a sharp, curious thud. I swiped the screen and pressed the phone firmly against my ear. "Isabella Thorne." Special Agent Davis's voice came through the speaker, sounding exceptionally grave and focused. "Yes, Agent Davis," I answered smoothly, motioning for the attorneys to hold their paperwork. "What is the update? Did Richard's legal team file another desperate motion?" "No, Ms. Thorne. Richard's defense strategy has completely collapsed following his panic attack in the jail. But that is not why I am calling you," Davis explained, taking a sharp breath on the other end of the line. "We just executed a federal search warrant on a high-security private storage locker registered under an alias connected to Cassandra Belmont. We found a secondary, highly concealed safe deposit box that was never logged in the estate's initial probate inventory." A secondary safe deposit box. I repeated, my professional estate appraiser instincts instantly flaring to life. "What was inside it? Cash? More fake art?" "No, Ms. Thorne, it is not cash," Davis replied, his voice dropping to a serious undertone. "It is a massive cache of historical estate items and rare physical assets that were allegedly reported stolen or missing over the past 15 years. The federal magistrate has officially seized the entire locker under federal asset forfeiture laws. But because the provenance and physical identification of these specialized antiques are so heavily disputed, the Department of Justice needs an immediate objective expert to step in. We need an elite certified estate appraiser to evaluate the lockbox contents and formally identify every single piece before we can present the new federal indictment to the grand jury." Agent Davis paused for a brief moment, letting the weight of his request settle over the line. "We need you down at the federal evidence lockup tomorrow morning, Ms. Thorne. Are you available to help us crack Cassandra's final secret?" "I am available, Agent Davis," I replied, tightening my grip on the heavy phone. "I will be there at 8 o'clock sharp." The following morning, I walked through the double doors of the federal evidence lockup. The facility was a cold concrete fortress buried deep beneath the city streets, smelling of ozone and bleach. Agent Davis waited inside a secure examination room. The space contained nothing but harsh fluorescent lights, a cold steel examination table, and high-definition surveillance cameras recording our every move. In the absolute center of the cold metal table was a massive rectangular steel lockbox. We pulled this out of a private underground vault, registered to a dummy corporation, tracing back to your stepmother Davis, explained sliding white cotton archival gloves across the table. We scanned it for explosives and chemical hazards. It is clear, but we have no idea what we are looking at. The inventory manifests were completely scrubbed. I pulled the white cotton gloves onto my hands, the familiar tightness shifting my brain into analytical mode. I unlatched the heavy metal clasps and pushed the lid backward. Inside, resting on preservation foam, were 5 cylindrical objects wrapped tightly in acid-free archival tissue paper. Cassandra was not just hiding cash, I murmured carefully, lifting the first heavy cylinder from the foam. She was hiding canvases. I placed the cylinder on the table and gently peeled back the archival tissue. As I unrolled the canvas and secured the corners, my breath caught in my throat. It was not a cheap reproduction or a modern fake like the furniture she bought. It was a visceral post-war painting. The aggressive, chaotic brushstrokes and textured layering were unmistakable to a trained eye. I unzipped my specialized appraisal kit and pulled out my magnifying loupe and a high-powered ultraviolet flashlight. I leaned close to the canvas, examining the microscopic cracking patterns in the dried oil paint. The chemical aging was entirely consistent with mid-20th century materials. Then I clicked on the ultraviolet light and slowly swept the purple beam across the bottom right corner of the raw canvas edge. A distinct invisible blue watermark glowed brightly under the UV beam. It was an intricate geometric seal belonging to a highly exclusive private gallery in Geneva, Switzerland. I stepped back from the table, my heart pounding a steady rhythm against my ribs. I looked at the other 4 wrapped canvases resting inside the metal lockbox. "Agent Davis," I said, keeping my voice level despite the adrenaline surging through my veins. 5 years ago, a highly sophisticated criminal syndicate bypassed a multi-million-dollar security system at a private gallery in Geneva. They stole 5 specific post-war masterpieces. It was one of the most notorious unsolved art heists of the decade. Interpol has been desperately hunting for these exact paintings ever since. Davis stared at the canvas, the realization dawning on his face. "You are telling me Cassandra Belmont is in possession of stolen European masterpieces. I am telling you she is the fence." I corrected him, examining the backing. She was not just buying fake wardrobes to launder stolen retirement funds. She was using the legitimate reputation of the Thorne family estate to smuggle stolen art across international borders. She brought these masterpieces into the United States under the guise of corporate imports, hiding them in secure vaults until she could sell them on the black market. The federal agent ran a hand over his buzzed scalp, a sharp, predatory smile breaking across his face. "This changes the entire scope of the investigation, Isabella. Wire fraud and domestic embezzlement were going to put her away for a decade. But international art smuggling, trafficking in stolen cultural property across federal borders. This is a completely different beast." "Exactly," I agreed carefully, wrapping the masterpiece back into its tissue paper. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation does not play games with international art syndicates. When you attach these canvases to Cassandra's name and cross-reference her travel logs to Switzerland, her crimes escalate. She is an active participant in an international criminal enterprise. Smuggling stolen cultural property of this magnitude carries a mandatory minimum of 25 years in federal prison. She will never see the outside of a cell again." Davis immediately pulled out his radio, calling for a secure transport team to transfer the canvases to the specialized FBI art crime unit. The trap I had laid for my family had just evolved into an inescapable iron cage. Over the next few weeks, the wheels of the federal justice system ground forward with terrifying speed. Based on my expert appraisal and the recovery of the stolen masterpieces, the grand jury handed down a devastating, watertight indictment. The trial date was officially set on the federal docket. Cassandra and Richard were denied bail, deemed extreme flight risks due to their offshore connections. But cornered animals always fight the hardest when they realize they have absolutely no way out. Sitting in my newly reclaimed office at the Thorne estate, I heard a sharp knock at the front door. I walked downstairs to find a private process server standing on my porch. He handed me a thick manila envelope without a word and walked away. I broke the seal and pulled out the legal documents. It was a subpoena. Cassandra had liquidated her last hidden cash reserves to hire the most ruthless defense attorney in the state. They knew they could not defeat the physical evidence of the stolen paintings or the recorded confessions. Their only remaining strategy was to completely destroy my credibility. The defense attorney was calling me to the stand. I read through the attached briefing, my eyes narrowing at their fabricated narrative. They were planning to paint me as a vindictive estranged daughter who had maliciously fabricated the entire financial collapse simply to steal the Thorne family estate. They wanted to tear me apart in front of a jury. The federal courthouse in downtown San Francisco was a fortress of polished granite and echoing hallways, completely swarmed by the media. Flashes blinded me as I walked past the barricades flanked by federal marshals. The clicking of camera shutters sounded like a swarm of angry hornets. The media frenzy was absolute, and the trial of the decade was officially underway. When I stepped through the heavy oak doors of the courtroom, the air felt thick with tension. I took my seat in the gallery directly behind the prosecution table. Across the aisle, sitting at the defense table, Richard and Cassandra looked absolutely terrified. The stress of federal lockup had aged them decades in a matter of months. Cassandra's roots were completely gray, her skin sallow and stripped of its expensive treatments. Richard sat hunched over, his hands trembling as he stared at the polished wood table. Neither of them dared to make eye contact with me. Currently occupying the witness stand was DeAndre. He traded his custom-tailored suits for an oversized bright orange federal prison jumpsuit. His wrists were shackled to a chain around his waist. DeAndre looked thoroughly broken. His arrogance was completely gone. Fulfilling his plea agreement, he spent the entire morning ruthlessly detailing Cassandra's international money laundering network. He explained exactly how she forced him to use his fake cryptocurrency hedge fund to mask the wire transfers sent to Geneva to purchase the stolen post-war masterpieces. Every word he spoke drove another nail into their coffins. Then it was my turn. The bailiff called my name. I walked confidently to the witness stand, placed my hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the absolute truth. The federal prosecutor took me through my professional appraisal of the fake antiques and the discovery of the stolen canvases. It was methodical and devastating to the defense. But then the cross-examination began. Cassandra's defense attorney, a ruthless man named Donahue, stepped up to the podium. He did not look at the jury. He locked his predatory gaze entirely on me. "Ms. Thorne," Donahue began, his voice dripping with theatrical condescension, "you present yourself as a completely objective professional today. But let us discuss your actual history with my client. Is it not true that you were entirely estranged from your father and stepmother for an entire decade?" I nodded. "I was financially and emotionally cut off when I was 18, yes." Donahue slammed his hand on the podium. "You were cut off because of your volatile, unstable behavior. Let us talk about your mother's funeral 10 years ago. Do you deny throwing a violent, screaming tantrum right in front of the grieving congregation when your father arrived with his new partner?" "I suffered a profound emotional shock at my mother's burial," I answered evenly. "It was not a tantrum. It was grief." "It was uncontrollable rage," Donahue shouted, pacing in front of the jury box. "A rage that festered for 10 long years while you lived in a modest apartment and watched your family thrive. I put it to you, Ms. Thorne, that there was no secret safe deposit box. I put it to you that you used your specialized skills as an estate appraiser to forge that Delaware Quiet Trust. You fabricated that handwritten letter from your late mother to illegally seize the Thorne estate and frame Cassandra Belmont for crimes she did not commit." The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. The judge banged his gavel, demanding order. Donahue smiled smugly, thinking he had finally rattled me. He thought I would break down, scream, or act like the emotional wreck my family had always claimed I was. I simply adjusted the microphone. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of anger. "Mr. Donahue," I replied, my voice slicing through the courtroom like ice. Your theory demonstrates a profound misunderstanding of forensic document analysis and the Uniform Trust Code. First, the Delaware Quiet Trust was filed and registered with the state chancery court 9 years before I ever stepped foot into that bank vault. The state seals are entirely authentic and federally verified. Second, the handwritten letter from my mother underwent gas chromatography testing by the Federal Bureau of Investigation Laboratory. The chemical age of the ink proves it was written exactly 10 years ago using a specific fountain pen dye that was discontinued by the manufacturer shortly after her death. It is physically impossible to forge. Donahue's smug smile began to falter. He opened his mouth to interrupt, but I completely talked over him. Furthermore, I continued, turning my gaze directly to the jury box. The bank where I discovered the safe deposit box maintains off-site encrypted metadata for all their security camera footage. The federal prosecutors have already submitted Exhibit 412, which is the time-stamped, unedited video of me physically drilling the rusted lock on my mother's abandoned box alongside the bank manager and an independent notary. The original documents were extracted on camera. I could not have planted them. Your theory is not just factually incorrect, it is scientifically impossible. A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. The federal judge nodded slowly, clearly impressed by the irrefutable chain of evidence I had just presented. The jury looked at me with absolute respect and then turned their collective glare toward the defense table. Cassandra buried her face in her hands. Donahue stood frozen at the podium, his entire strategy completely annihilated by cold, hard, verifiable facts. He scrambled through his legal pads, his face flushed with embarrassment. He knew he could not defeat the forensic evidence. He needed a character assassination, and he needed it immediately. "No further questions for this witness," Donahue muttered, retreating to the defense table in defeat. I stepped down from the witness stand, feeling a surge of absolute victory. I took my seat behind the prosecutors, watching the defense team panic. The judge looked down over his glasses. "Mr. Donahue, does the defense have any further witnesses to call?" Donahue conferred frantically with Cassandra. She grabbed his arm, whispering aggressively into his ear. Donahue stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a renewed, desperate energy. "Yes, Your Honor," Donahue announced, his voice echoing loudly across the courtroom. "The defense calls a rebuttal witness. We call Penelope Belmont to the stand." The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Penelope walked down the center aisle. She was no longer wearing the dirty sweatpants from the Wall Street boardroom. She was dressed in a conservative, modest maternity dress, holding her slightly rounded stomach to maximize sympathy from the jury. Her performance was calculated to portray a helpless, terrified victim. She refused to look at me as she walked past the gallery and took her seat on the witness stand. The prosecutor leaned over to me, whispering frantically, "Why are they calling her? She has no knowledge of the offshore accounts." "She does not," I whispered back, my eyes narrowing as Penelope swore her oath. Donahue approached the stand with a predatory smile. "Ms. Belmont, why are you here today?" he asked softly. Penelope wiped a fake tear from her eye, pointing a trembling finger directly at me. "I am here because Isabella Thorne came to my house months ago. She looked me in the eye and verbally threatened to forge whatever documents she needed to completely destroy our family and steal our entire fortune." The entire courtroom gasped loudly. Donahue let the shockwave roll through the gallery, placing a comforting hand on the wooden railing of the witness stand. "And did your stepsister explain how she planned to execute this massive theft?" he asked, his voice dripping with manufactured sympathy. Penelope dabbed her eyes with a tissue, her lower lip trembling flawlessly. "She said her job gave her access to hidden bank registries and antique authentication seals. She bragged that she could manipulate any paper trail to make my stepfather look like a criminal and frame my mother for money laundering. She just wanted the mansion all to herself because she has always been bitterly jealous of my happiness." It was a spectacular performance. If I did not know she had spent the last 2 months living in a cheap motel racking up credit card debt, I might have applauded her acting skills. Cassandra sat at the defense table, nodding solemnly, playing the tragic mother whose family was being ripped apart by a psychotic stepchild. Thank you, Penelope Donahue said, turning to the jury with a grave expression. Your bravery today has finally brought the truth to light. I pass the witness. The federal prosecutor stood up from his table. He did not look angry. He looked like a man holding a royal flush. He buttoned his suit jacket and walked slowly toward the podium carrying a single manila folder. Ms. Belmont, the prosecutor, began, his voice calm and resonant. You just testified under oath that Isabella Thorne orchestrated this entire financial collapse. You claim she masterminded a complex web of wire fraud simply to steal a house. Is that your sworn testimony? Yes, Penelope answered, lifting her chin defiantly. She set us up. The prosecutor nodded slowly. Let us talk about the timeline of this supposed setup. He opened his folder. I would like to direct your attention to Sunday, May 14th, Mother's Day, a brunch at Le Jardin in San Francisco. Do you recall being there? Penelope shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Yes, we were celebrating my mother. The prosecutor signaled the court clerk. Your Honor, the prosecution requests permission to play Prosecution Exhibit 420. It is an audio recording taken directly by Isabella Thorne on that exact date legally obtained under California's single-party consent exception for recording conversations that capture active extortion and felony admissions. The judge granted permission. Donahue leaped to his feet, shouting an objection, claiming the audio lacked foundational context. The judge overruled him instantly, demanding the defense take their seat. The clerk pressed a button on the courtroom audio system. Suddenly, Penelope's own shrill, hysterical voice echoed off the courtroom walls, crystal clear and absolutely devastating. You are doing this because you cannot stand the fact that DeAndre bought me a brand new Porsche yesterday while you drive a pathetic used sedan, the recording blared. Then my voice cut in cool and collected. Bought a Porsche with the Thorne corporate credit card. The same corporation where 80% of the outstanding shares were legally frozen at 8 a.m. today. The audio continued playing the exact moment DeAndre's fraudulent reality was exposed, followed by Penelope's own desperate demands for DeAndre to use his hidden offshore crypto accounts to fix the situation. The recording proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Penelope was fully aware of DeAndre's illicit spending and the stolen corporate funds. The prosecutor signaled the clerk to stop the audio. The courtroom was dead silent. Ms. Belmont, the prosecutor said, leaning against the podium. In that recording, you are actively defending the purchase of a luxury vehicle using stolen corporate funds well before Ms. Thorne ever presented the Delaware Quiet Trust documents. If Ms. Thorne orchestrated this entire collapse as a surprise attack, how exactly were you and your husband already spending embezzled Thorne corporate money on Porsches? Penelope's face drained of all color. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted wildly toward Donahue, who was staring at his legal pad in absolute defeat, and then toward Cassandra, who was gripping the edge of the defense table in sheer panic. I misspoke on that recording. Penelope stammered, fresh sweat ruining her carefully applied makeup. I was confused. I did not know where the money came from. The federal judge leaned forward, clasping his hands together over his heavy wooden desk. His expression was as hard as granite. Ms. Belmont, the judge, warned, his voice booming with absolute authority. I am going to stop you right there before you say another word. You are currently sitting in a federal witness stand. Perjury in a federal fraud trial is a felony offense. It carries a mandatory sentence of up to 5 years in a federal penitentiary. I strongly suggest you think very carefully about your next sentence. Did Isabella Thorne forge these documents and orchestrate this collapse? Or did you lie to this court today? The threat of actual prison time shattered Penelope's remaining resolve like fragile glass. She looked at the armed federal marshals standing by the doors. She looked at DeAndre in his orange jumpsuit. The reality of a concrete cell crashed down on her. I lied! Penelope shrieked, bursting into genuine hysterical tears. She pointed a shaking finger directly at the defense table. My mother told me to do it. Cassandra said if I got up here and blamed Isabella for everything, the jury would acquit them and we would get the estate back. She promised me I would get my trust fund back. I do not want to go to jail. Please, I just did what she told me to do. The courtroom erupted into total chaos. Reporters furiously typed on their phones. Cassandra buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking as her own daughter sold her out to save herself. Donahue threw his pen onto the table, knowing his case was completely and permanently dead. The judge slammed his gavel repeatedly, demanding order, his face red with fury at the blatant subornation of perjury. Bailiff, escort this witness out of the courtroom and hold her in the holding cell pending a review for perjury charges, the judge barked. Penelope wailed as two armed guards grabbed her arms, dragging her away from the stand. Her cries echoed down the marble hallway until the heavy doors swung shut. The judge glared at the defense table with absolute disgust before turning to the jury. Given the dramatic turn of events and the complete collapse of the defense's rebuttal, we will skip closing arguments and move directly to jury instructions, the judge announced. The defense has officially rested. Within 30 minutes, the judge delivered the legal parameters, and the jury was formally dismissed to deliberate. The courtroom began to clear out as reporters rushed to file their breaking news updates. The federal marshals moved in to secure the defendants. I remained seated in the front row of the gallery, calmly gathering my legal pads and sliding them into my leather briefcase. I felt a pair of eyes burning into the side of my face. I turned my head slowly. Richard was standing by the defense table waiting for the marshals to cuff his wrists. The arrogant, untouchable patriarch who had stolen my college fund and let me suffer alone was entirely gone. He was just a pathetic, ruined old man facing a decade behind bars. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a desperate, miserable plea for mercy. He slowly mouthed the words, "I am sorry," across the quiet courtroom. I looked him dead in the eyes. I did not nod. I did not blink. I did not offer a single ounce of forgiveness or acknowledgement. I simply turned my back on him, completely, snapped my briefcase shut, and walked toward the heavy oak doors, leaving him to face the absolute devastation he had built with his own two hands. 4 grueling hours was all it took for the jury to reach a unanimous decision. In the federal justice system, 4 hours is a lightning strike. It meant there was no hesitation and absolutely no doubt in the minds of the 12 men and women who held my family's fate. When the wooden door to the deliberation room swung open, the tension inside the courtroom became suffocating. The air grew thick, pulling the oxygen out of the lungs of everyone seated at the defense table. Reporters stopped whispering. The marshals shifted their weight, moving closer to the defendants. I sat perfectly still in the front row of the gallery, watching the foreperson hand a sealed envelope to the bailiff, who then passed it up to the towering mahogany bench. The federal judge put on his reading glasses, sliding his finger along the edge of the envelope to break the seal. He unfolded the verdict form, his face completely devoid of emotion. He looked out over the courtroom, his stern gaze locking onto the defense table. The defendants were instructed to rise. DeAndre stood up first, his orange prison jumpsuit hanging loosely over his frame. Richard struggled to his feet, his knees visibly buckling, requiring his defense attorney to hold him upright. Cassandra rose last, her hands gripping the edge of the wooden table so tightly her knuckles looked like polished bone. We, the jury, find the defendant, DeAndre Jenkins, guilty on all counts of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, bank fraud, and identity theft. The judge read, his voice booming across the silent room. DeAndre closed his eyes and let out a shaky breath, accepting his inevitable ruin. Because of your extensive cooperation with the federal prosecutors, the judge continued, I am accepting the terms of your plea agreement. You are hereby sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. DeAndre simply nodded, bowing his head as a marshal stepped forward to secure his chains. The judge turned his piercing gaze toward my father. Richard Thorne, on the charges of federal tax evasion, international money laundering, and the embezzlement of protected educational trust funds. How does the jury find guilty on all counts? The judge announced, slamming the paper flat onto his desk. Richard let out a pathetic whimper, his legs giving out completely as he collapsed backward into his wooden chair. You exploited your own daughter and stole her future to fund your illicit lifestyle, the judge reprimanded fiercely. You are sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. Richard buried his face in his trembling hands, openly weeping. as the reality of dying in a concrete cell crashed down upon his shoulders. Finally, the judge directed his absolute fury toward my stepmother, Cassandra Belmont, on the charges of conspiracy to commit wire fraud, international art smuggling, and trafficking stolen cultural property. The jury finds you guilty on all counts. Cassandra let out a shriek, but her defense attorney pulled her back up to her feet, forcing her to face the bench. You orchestrated a sophisticated criminal enterprise utilizing a legitimate family estate to fence stolen European masterpieces, the judge stated, his voice dripping with utter contempt. You manipulated the legal system, suborned perjury, and attempted to steal an inheritance out of pure greed. Your crimes warrant the absolute maximum penalty. You are hereby sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Cassandra screamed a primal, deafening sound of pure terror. She thrashed against the defense table, begging the judge for mercy, screaming that she could not survive in prison, but the gavel slammed down with thunderous finality. The criminal sentences were officially locked, but the justice system was not finished with them yet. Before we adjourn this sentencing phase, I have signed the prosecution's financial restitution orders, the judge declared, lifting a secondary stack of thick legal documents. The financial penalties levied against the defendants are absolute and immediate. To satisfy the stolen assets, including the $250,000 embezzled directly from Isabella Thorne's college fund, the government is hereby authorizing the total liquidation of all personal effects belonging to Richard Thorne and Cassandra Belmont. The marshals are instructed to seize everything down to the defendants' designer shoes, luxury handbags, and custom jewelry. Every cent recovered will be directed toward fulfilling the financial restitution owed to the primary victim. Cassandra stopped screaming, her mouth falling open in sheer horror. She was not just going to federal prison for the rest of her natural life. She was going to prison completely penniless, stripped of the glamorous, wealthy identity she had spent decades ruthlessly stealing from my mother. Her elite country club friends would watch her entire wardrobe, her diamond necklaces and her prized high heels, auctioned off to the highest bidder by the federal government. The complete social and financial annihilation was absolute. The judge neatly stacked his paperwork, preparing to officially close the trial that had captivated the entire city. The federal marshals stepped forward, gripping the defendants by their arms, ready to haul them back to the holding cells beneath the courthouse. But before the judge struck his gavel for the final time, he paused, looking out over the crowded and completely silent gallery. Under federal law, the court recognizes the right of the primary victim to address the convicted parties before they are remanded to the custody of the Bureau of Prisons, the judge announced, his voice softening slightly as he looked directly at me. Does the primary victim wish to make a formal statement to the court today? The entire courtroom went dead silent. The reporters slowly lowered their notepads. Cassandra, Richard, and DeAndre turned their heads, looking back at the gallery. I took a deep, steadying breath. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored blazer, grabbed my leather briefcase, and stood up from the wooden bench. I stepped out of the aisle and began my walk directly toward the center podium to speak. The wooden floorboards creaked slightly beneath my heels as I approached the center podium. I did not rush. I did not lower my head. Every camera lens in the gallery was fixed on my back, and every eye at the defense table burned with a mixture of terror and hatred. I placed my leather briefcase on the wooden stand, unclasped the brass locks, and folded my hands neatly on top of the smooth leather. I looked up at the federal judge, then slowly turned my gaze to the jury, and finally, I locked eyes with the people who had spent a decade trying to destroy my life. Your Honor! I began, my voice projecting crisp and clear through the courtroom microphone. It did not tremble. I did not shed a single tear. I am not standing here today to ask for your pity. I am not a victim. I am the executor of my mother's will, and I am the architect of the ruin sitting at that defense table. For 10 years, the people in this room and the high society circles of San Francisco believed a carefully crafted lie. They were told that my mother, Helen Thorne, was a weak, confused woman who tragically passed away, leaving her vulnerable estate in the hands of a benevolent husband and his new, glamorous wife. They were told that I was a volatile, ungrateful daughter who had to be cut off for her own good. I stepped out from behind the podium, removing the physical barrier between myself and the defense table. I wanted them to see every inch of my confidence. But Helen Thorne was not weak. I stated, my voice echoing off the high granite walls. She was a brilliant, meticulous woman who saw the rot in her own home long before her heart gave out. She knew exactly what Richard and Cassandra were. She knew they lacked the intelligence to build their own wealth and the morality to protect hers. My mother did not die a helpless victim. She spent her final months building a financial and legal guillotine in the state of Delaware, knowing that eventually their own insatiable greed would trigger the blade. Today, the federal justice system is simply carrying out the final clause of her will. Today, the law is working exactly as my mother designed it. I turned my body facing Richard and Cassandra directly. Richard was staring at the floor, a broken, pathetic shell of a man. Cassandra was trembling, her hands shackled behind her back, her breathing shallow and frantic. "You threw me out into the cold when I was just 18 years old," I said, addressing them with absolute icy detachment. "You handed me $200, locked the heavy iron gates of my own ancestral home, and told me I was entirely on my own. You stole my college fund to pay off secret gambling debts. You watched me struggle to pay rent, eat cheap meals, and work grueling night shifts, all while you hosted lavish country club galas funded by stolen money." I took a slow, deliberate step closer to their table. "You spent 10 years telling society I was a failure because I worked for a living." I announced, ensuring every single reporter in the gallery caught the exact phrasing. "You mocked my profession. You called me a junk dealer. You laughed at the fact that I spent my days crawling through dusty archives, examining old furniture and analyzing chemical paint compositions. You thought because I was getting my hands dirty I was beneath you. But the work you mocked gave me the skills to uncover your crimes, dismantle your lies, and legally erase you from my family's legacy. My career as an estate appraiser taught me how to find the hidden ledgers you thought you burned. It taught me how to spot the fake antiques you used to launder millions offshore. It taught me how to trace the stolen post-war masterpieces you smuggled across international borders. The very independence you forced upon me became the exact weapon I used to destroy you." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. The jury watched me with profound respect. The federal judge nodded slowly, acknowledging the sheer power of the truth, laying bare the criminals in his courtroom. I did not need to scream. I did not need to cry. My victory was absolute, cemented in federal law, and unshakable forensic evidence. "I have reclaimed my mother's estate," I concluded, turning back to face the judge. "I have recovered the stolen assets. And I have ensured that the individuals who intentionally withheld life-saving medication from a dying woman will never breathe free air again. I ask the court to impose the maximum sentences without leniency." "Thank you, Your Honor." I walked back to the podium, picked up my leather briefcase, and returned to my seat in the front row of the gallery. The judge struck his heavy wooden gavel against the sounding block. The sharp, violent crack signaled the absolute end of the Thorne family nightmare. "This court is adjourned," the judge declared. "Bailiffs remand the prisoners to federal custody." The armed federal marshals immediately stepped forward. They grabbed Richard by his upper arms, hauling him out of his chair. He let out a pathetic, weak sob as they shoved him toward the holding cell door. Then 2 more marshals flanked Cassandra. They gripped her shoulders firmly. The heavy metallic sound of steel handcuffs clicking tightly shut around her wrists echoed loudly in the silent, cavernous courtroom. The sharp, ratcheting noise was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of my complete and total vindication. Cassandra was forcibly marched down the center aisle toward the heavy, secure doors at the back of the courtroom. As the marshals pushed her forward, she stopped resisting. Her posture completely caved in. Right before she crossed the threshold into the dark holding area, Cassandra turned her head and looked over her shoulder. She locked eyes with me one final time. There was no anger left in her expression. There was no arrogance. Her eyes were wide, hollow, and filled with the terrifying realization of total defeat. She finally understood that the stepdaughter she had treated like garbage had systematically and flawlessly orchestrated her permanent ruin. The heavy metal door slammed shut behind her, sealing her fate for the next 25 years. I turned away from the empty defense table. I walked up the center aisle, passing the rows of awestruck reporters and spectators. I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse and stepped out onto the wide stone steps. The bright, warm California sunlight washed over my face. The oppressive weight I had carried in my chest for an entire decade instantly evaporated into the crisp morning air. I took a deep, refreshing breath. I was a completely free woman. The drive back to the Thorne estate was the most peaceful journey of my entire life. I rolled the windows down, letting the crisp California ocean breeze whip through my hair. For a decade, this route had been a source of profound anxiety, a physical reminder of the heritage that was stolen from me. Today, it was a victory lap. I pulled up to the massive wrought iron gates. They were no longer chained shut by the bank. The eviction notices and foreclosure warnings had been thoroughly scraped off the stone pillars. When my legal team presented the Delaware Quiet Trust documentation to the federal bank, the executives realized their fatal error. Because my mother's trust predated DeAndre's fraudulent loan by nearly a decade, the bank had absolutely no legal claim to the property. The collateral was legally void. They were forced to immediately release the deed back into my name entirely free and clear. I pressed the remote button on my sun visor. The heavy iron gate swung open smoothly, welcoming the rightful owner home. I drove up the winding oak-lined driveway and parked my practical sedan right in front of the grand portico, occupying the exact spot where Penelope used to park her illegally purchased Porsche. I stepped out of the car, looking up at the sprawling stone facade. The house was magnificent, but the energy radiating from it felt suffocatingly toxic. Cassandra had spent 10 years infecting this beautiful property with her tacky, ostentatious taste. I unlocked the heavy front door and stepped into the grand foyer. The air inside smelled of stale, expensive perfume and cheap champagne. It smelled like fake money and ruthless social climbing. I did not waste a single second. I pulled out my phone and signaled the crew I had hired earlier that morning. Within minutes, a fleet of heavy-duty moving trucks and industrial dumpsters rolled up the driveway. A team of 30 professional liquidators and contractors swarmed into the mansion awaiting my direct orders. "Tear it all down," I instructed the foreman, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. Every piece of velvet drapery, every gold-plated fixture she installed, every piece of mass-produced furniture the feds did not already seize. I want the walls stripped bare by sunset. The cleansing was incredibly therapeutic. I stood in the center of the living room, watching the crew ruthlessly dismantle Cassandra's gaudy empire. They ripped down the heavy, suffocating window treatments, letting the bright natural sunlight flood into the room for the first time in 10 years. They hauled out the ugly, uncomfortable chaise lounges and the fake crystal chandeliers that looked like they belonged in a cheap casino. But the ultimate satisfaction came when we reached the formal dining room. Hanging directly above the massive marble fireplace was a giant, arrogant oil portrait of Cassandra. She had commissioned it shortly after marrying my father, demanding the artist paint her dripping in diamonds with a sickeningly smug smile on her face. She had placed it there to force everyone who ate at that table to literally look up to her. "Get that monstrosity off my wall," I commanded two burly movers. They grabbed the heavy gilded frame, yanking it hard. The mounting brackets groaned and the portrait came completely free. I followed them as they carried it straight out the front doors and heaved it over the edge of a massive industrial dumpster. The sound of the thick canvas tearing and the expensive wooden frame splintering against rusty metal was absolute music to my ears. The woman who had spent a decade trying to erase me from high society was now literally lying in a pile of garbage where she belonged. With the toxic debris finally cleared out, the house felt lighter. The oppressive museum-like sterility was gone. It was time to bring the soul back into the Thorne estate. I walked out to my car and carefully lifted a secure, climate-controlled art crate from the trunk. I brought it inside, setting it gently on the floor in front of the now empty space above the marble fireplace. I unlatched the crate and pulled away the protective archival foam. Inside was a breathtaking, elegant portrait of my mother, Helen. She was painted in soft, warm tones, smiling with genuine kindness and brilliant intelligence. Richard had banished this painting to a dark, damp corner of the basement the day he moved his mistress into the master suite. He wanted to pretend Helen never existed. I carried the painting up the small stepladder and secured it perfectly onto the wall. I stepped back, admiring the view. The transformation was instantaneous. The moment my mother's smiling face looked out over the room, the entire atmosphere of the mansion shifted. The coldness evaporated. The house felt warm, welcoming, and vibrantly alive for the very first time in a decade. We had won. The estate was finally cleansed of the parasites who had tried to bleed it dry. As the afternoon turned into evening, the moving crews packed up their trucks and left me alone in my newly reclaimed home. I decided to tackle the final room on the ground floor, Richard's old mahogany study. It was the room where he had coldly told me my college fund was gone. I walked in grabbing a heavy trash bag and started throwing his leftover cigars, his golf magazines, and his pretentious business awards directly into the garbage. I approached his massive antique oak desk. As a high-end estate appraiser, I know exactly how master craftsmen built furniture in the late 19th century. I ran my fingers along the underside of the heavy center drawer, feeling for the distinct groove of a hidden compartment. My thumb brushed against a small concealed wooden latch. I pressed it firmly. A hidden panel dropped open with a soft click. Richard was a coward, but he was also a hoarder of secrets. He had used this compartment to hide his illicit affairs and stolen funds. But as I reached inside the dark, dusty space, my hand brushed against something entirely unexpected. It was not a bank ledger or a blackmail file. It was a pristine white envelope that looked incredibly old. I pulled it out and turned it over. My name, Isabella, was written across the front in my mother's elegant flowing handwriting. My heart skipped a beat. I broke the wax seal and slid the contents out onto the leather desk pad. It was a perfectly preserved, untouched federal savings bond issued on the exact day I was born, accompanied by a small handwritten note. While Richard had been busy stealing my future to pay off gambling debts, my brilliant mother had quietly hidden a secondary safety net right under his nose, knowing he was too foolish to ever find the desk's secret compartment. I stared at the paper tears of pure gratitude finally welling in my eyes. The tears did not last long, replaced quickly by a profound, unbreakable sense of purpose. I held the crisp, aged paper of the federal savings bond in my hands, tracing the meticulous blue ink of my mother's signature. The next morning, I walked straight into the main branch of the very bank that had once held my mother's secret safe deposit box. I bypassed the standard teller line and sat directly in the office of the regional manager. I presented the matured savings bond across the polished desk. Thanks to decades of uninterrupted compound interest and the sheer age of the document, the financial value had multiplied exponentially. It was a massive, staggering sum of money, easily enough to purchase a luxury penthouse or launch an entirely new corporate venture. I instructed the manager to deposit the funds directly into the newly reclaimed primary accounts of the Thorne estate. But as I watched the digital numbers on my banking portfolio swell, I knew with absolute certainty that I would never spend a single dime of that specific money on myself. My mother had intended this secret fund to be my ultimate safety net, a financial shield against the exact familial abuse I had endured for the last decade. But I did not need a safety net anymore. I had systematically dismantled my abusers and built an impenetrable fortress of wealth and security. Yet I knew there were countless other young women out there who were currently trapped in the cold, suffocating grip of greedy relatives, women who had no resources, no legal knowledge, and no way out. Within a month, I converted the massive unused eastern wing of the Thorne estate into a state-of-the-art corporate workspace. I spared absolutely no expense. I hired the sharpest, most aggressive probate lawyers, forensic accountants, and private investigators I could find in San Francisco. I registered the legal paperwork and officially launched the Helen Thorne Foundation. It was not a superficial charity that handed out simple platitudes or basic counseling. It was a high-powered, completely free legal and financial advisory clinic strictly dedicated to helping young women who were active victims of familial financial abuse, inheritance theft, and trust fund manipulation. We took on the complex, highly contentious cases that terrified regular attorneys. We hunted down embezzled college funds, exposed forged wills, and legally eviscerated the toxic parents and siblings who thought they could steal from their own blood without ever facing a consequence. Every time my team froze a fraudulent family account or handed a predatory relative a federal subpoena, I felt my mother's incredible legacy growing stronger. I was turning my past trauma into an absolute unstoppable weapon for justice. While I built an empire of empowerment, the people who had tried to destroy me were actively living out their own personal, inescapable nightmares. Penelope Belmont, the former golden child who once threw ice water in my face and refused to wear anything less than custom Chanel silk, was now wearing a grease-stained, ill-fitting polyester uniform. She spent her days standing on her swollen, aching feet, handing cheap paper bags of fast food through a drive-through window in a bleak industrial suburb. Her manicured nails were ruined, replaced by burn marks from the deep fryer. There were no elite country club lunches, no luxury sports cars, and absolutely no wealthy husbands waiting to bail her out. Whenever a rude customer yelled at her over a missing packet of ketchup, Penelope just swallowed her pride and apologized, utterly crushed by the brutal, exhausting reality of minimum wage survival. Miles away, hidden behind razor wire and concrete walls, the architects of my misery were serving their time. Inside a maximum security federal penitentiary, Cassandra sat heavily on a thin, uncomfortable mattress in a cell measuring exactly 8 by 10 feet. She wore a standard-issue faded gray jumpsuit. Her face was entirely devoid of expensive makeup, highlighting every deep wrinkle and shadow of regret. Her elite socialite status, her country club memberships, and her stolen European artwork were permanently erased, leaving her with absolutely nothing but the deafening silence of a concrete box. In a different federal facility, Richard spent his strictly monitored recreation time pacing a small chain-link enclosure. He was entirely alone. The other inmates ignored him, viewing him as just another pathetic, ruined old man. He was completely stripped of his untouchable offshore pensions, his arrogant pride, and his family. They were no longer the mighty rulers of San Francisco high society. They were simply federal inmate numbers rotting away in the dark. I stepped out onto the sprawling master balcony of the Thorne estate. The morning air was crisp and carried the faint, sweet scent of blooming jasmine from the restored botanical gardens below. I leaned against the cool stone balustrade, taking a slow, satisfying sip of my perfectly brewed black coffee. The heavy iron gates at the end of the long driveway stood wide open, welcoming the bright future instead of keeping the world locked out. My smartphone buzzed softly in the pocket of my tailored trousers. I pulled it out and glanced at the bright screen. It was an email from the executive director of a major international auction house, officially confirming my flight to London the following week. They needed my specific expertise to appraise a newly discovered, highly secretive historical estate. I smiled, locking the screen and slipping the phone back into my pocket. I did not need to run from my past anymore, and I certainly did not need anyone's validation to know my own worth. My life was brilliant, secure, and entirely my own. I took one last look at the beautiful sunrise painting the California sky in vibrant shades of gold and amber, savoring the absolute peace of my ultimate victory as the world around me slowly faded to black. The ultimate lesson from Isabella's difficult journey is that true power does not come from stolen wealth or loud arrogance. It comes from silent preparation, unwavering patience, and absolute financial independence. When toxic family members underestimate your worth, your best revenge is never a shouting match. Instead, it is the quiet, relentless pursuit of your own success. Isabella proved that while lies and manipulation might build a temporary empire, the truth will eventually shatter it. Never let anyone dictate your value or steal your future. Build your own fortress, master your craft, and let your undeniable success speak for itself. If you have ever had to build your own success after being underestimated by the people closest to you, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of ultimate justice.